He was just a single dad with nothing left but a few crumpled bills, and a foolish bit on a rotting boat no one else wanted. Neighbors laughed. His own family begged him to sell, and even his kids doubted it would ever float. But when strange journals, hidden vaults, and century-old secrets surfaced from within his hull, the Aurora's wake became more than a gamble. It became their legacy. What happens when a forgotten ship turns into proof that storms can be weathered, and history itself chooses who carries it forward? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The wind off the harbor carried the smell of salt and engine oil as the auctioneer's voice rang out over the scattered crowd. It was a kind of sale that drew bargain hunters, scrap dealers, and the occasional dreamer who thought they might find something overlooked. Rusting trawlers, dented speedboats, and weather-beaten skiffs were lined up along the dock, each one numbered with peeling paint. Most eyes stayed on the cleaner vessels, the ones that looked like they might still have some life in them. Nobody paid much attention to the derelict fishing boat sitting at the far end. Its hull was streaked with rust and barnacles, paint hanging in ragged flakes like old bark on a tree. A sagging tarp covered part of the deck, torn in places, revealing broken planks and coils of rope that looked more like seaweed than anything useful. Ethan Ross stood among the bidders, hands deep in the pockets of his worn jacket. At 42, he carried the tired look of a man who had worked too many jobs that never lasted long enough. His dark hair was touched with early gray at the temples, his shoulders broad but bent with responsibility. Next to him, his son Daniel, 16, shifted impatiently, arms crossed, a scowl on his face. Lily, only 11, clutched her father's sleeve with one hand, her eyes bright and curious despite the cold. When the auctioneer reached a neglected vessel, his tone changed, more hurried now, as though eager to get past it. Lot 27, one fishing boat, no guarantees. Starting bid at 200. The crowd chuckled. A man in a greasy cap muttered that the boat wasn't worth the dock fees to keep it tied up. Another shook his head, whispering that the thing should be cut up for scrap. The laughter was easy, dismissive, the kind that always seemed to find its way toward men like Ethan. Daniel leaned closer to his father, lowering his voice. "Dad, please don't. We can't even afford to fix a car, let alone that thing." Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the boat, eyes tracing the lines of its hull beneath the corrosion. To anyone else, it was just another sinking hulk waiting for the scrapyard. But something about the shape, the way the stern curved, the way the name had been crudely painted over and then faded with time, it caught him. He thought about the nights he had spent lying awake in their cramped apartment, wondering how he was going to provide more than just survival for his kids. Sometimes you didn't buy what you could afford. Sometimes you bought what you believed might give you a future. The auctioneer dropped the price. 150. 100. Silence. The boat stood unwanted, a ghost of better days. Then Ethan raised his hand. The sound carried across the dock like a challenge. Heads turned. Someone laughed out loud. Figures. A man called. Ross buying garbage again. Ethan ignored it, his jaw tightening. 100 going once. The auctioneer pressed, relieved to see a hand at all. Going twice. Sold. The gavel hit the block with a hollow crack. Just like that, the boat belonged to him. Lily's eyes widened, a smile flickering across her face before she looked at her brother. Daniel shook his head, disbelief written all over him. "You just bought a pile of rot, Dad. What are we supposed to do with it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He watched as dock hands tied a tag to the railing of the vessel, marking it as sold. The laughter behind him stung, but not as much as his son's doubt. He turned finally, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. Daniel looked away, unconvinced, but Lily squeezed her father's arm tighter, as if she believed in him even if no one else did. Around them, the crowd had already moved on to the next lot, another boat that looked cleaner, safer, easier to imagine afloat. But for Ethan Ross, the decision had already been made. He owned the Shabby vessel now, for better or worse. What he couldn't know, standing there on the cold dock, was that inside those rotting planks and rusting nails, something waited. something that would change all their lives in ways no one watching that morning could have imagined. The news spread quickly along the dock, as it always did in places where men worked side by side and gossip traveled faster than tide. Ethan Ross had bought the wreck. The shabby fishing boat with its rotting hull and sagging deck was now his responsibility, and for many, the thought was more entertaining than surprising. Dock hands leaned on crates, smirking as they watched him stand at the edge of the pier, staring at what he had just claimed. A pair of fishermen shook their heads, one muttering that it would sink before the week was out. Someone else called it Ross's folly, the same way they had called his failed hardware shop 5 years ago. Daniel heard the whispers too, though they weren't even trying to be quiet. His face burned as he shoved his hands into his hoodie pocket, avoiding the stares of other kids hanging around the marina. At 16, pride mattered, and having everyone watch his father by a sinking wreck felt like another reason for people to laugh at them. He kicked at a loose nail on the dock, his voice low but sharp. "Dad, they're right. This thing's not a boat, it's a coffin." Ethan didn't answer right away. He had heard every word and knew every glance. It was nothing new. For years, he had lived under the weight of other people's judgments. When he lost his house, when he took up odd jobs, when his marriage broke apart. Each failure had been marked by whispers that followed him like shadows. Now, with his children beside him, he tried to keep his voice steady. "It's not a coffin. It's wood and steel. That means it can be fixed." Daniel's laugh was humorless. "With what money? You think teaching side jobs and patching drywall for pennies is going to cover this? We'll drown before you get floating." Ethan turned toward his son, catching the anger and fear in his eyes. He wanted to remind him that they had always gotten by, that every challenge had been survived somehow. But Daniel was old enough to see the cracks, to feel the weight of their thin wallets and second-hand lives. He was becoming the realist in the family, the one who measured every choice against the hard truth of numbers. Lily stood on the dock a step behind them, her small hands gripping the rail. She was quiet, as she often was when voices rose, but her eyes never left the boat. Where others saw decay, she searched for shape and detail, the curve of the hull, the faded carvings near the bow. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but steady. "It looks tired, Dad, like it wants someone to care about again." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. She had her mother's way of seeing beauty where others only saw ruin. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "That's exactly right. It just needs someone who won't walk away from it." Behind them, the jeers continued. A man laughed that Ross should have saved his money for life jackets. Another suggested the scrap yard was offering free towing if he wanted to cut his losses early. The words cut sharper because they were spoken openly, without malice but with the certainty that he'd made another mistake. Daniel pulled his hood tighter over his head, muttering, "Why do you always have to be the one they talk about? Couldn't you just let it go for once?" Ethan straightened, looking out at the boat as the tide lapped gently against its sides. He didn't have an easy answer, only the unshakable sense that walking away from this would be like surrendering the last piece of himself that still believed in possibility. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, firm despite Daniel's resistance. Sometimes what everyone else laughs at is exactly the thing worth fighting for. The boy didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. Lily leaned into her father's side, her small frame warm against his jacket. The three of them stood together at the edge of the dock, while voices rose and faded around them. The whispers would follow, just as they always had. But Ethan knew the moment he stepped onto the shabby deck that their lives had already shifted. What they had bought was not just a broken vessel, it was a test. Whether they sank or found a way forward would depend not on the boat, but on how much they were willing to believe in something no one else could see. The gangplank creaked beneath their feet as Ethan led the way, his boots heavy against the weathered wood. The boat swayed gently with the tide, its old rope straining against the dock cleats, groaning like an animal too weary to move. Daniel hesitated at the edge, arms folded tightly across his chest. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, but the dock workers hadn't left. A few still lingered with folded arms and amused smirks. They wanted to see how far this foolishness would go. Lily, however, was the first to step onto the deck after her father, her small sneakers pressing into the soft, peeling boards with a crunch of flaking paint. She wrinkled her nose at the smell. It was a mix of mildew, rust, and something sour that had seeped into the planks after years of neglect. The deck itself was a patchwork of faded gray and green paint, bubbled and cracked from too many seasons of salt water and sun. Coils of rope lay stiff and brittle near the railing, hardened into useless tangles. A set of rusted bolts clung to one corner, where a winch had once been mounted, orange flakes drifting off at the slightest touch. Ethan ran his hand over the railing, the wood rough and splintered beneath his calloused palm. He said nothing at first, letting the silence fill with the groans of the hull and the faint slap of water against its side. Daniel finally stepped aboard, though reluctantly, his sneakers scraping against the worn boards. "This thing smells like it's been rotting since before I was born," he muttered, his face twisted in disgust. He nudged at a loose plank with the toe of his shoe, watching it shift with a hollow sound. "Pretty sure it's going to fall apart under us." Ethan crouched near the plank, testing it with his weight. It held, though barely. "She's been through worse," he said, though his voice carried more conviction than certainty. Lily wandered toward the cabin entrance, the faded door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. She touched the handle, wincing at the chill of corroded metal before pushing it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, echoing across the marina and drawing another laugh from the dock. Inside, the smell hit them harder, a damp, suffocating staleness that clung to everything. Dust motes danced in the narrow beam of sunlight that cut through a cracked porthole. The cabin was small and cramped, with peeling wallpaper curling away from the walls in strips. The floor was warped from water damage, boards swollen and uneven. A narrow table sat against one wall, its surface covered in stains and the outline of objects long since removed. Daniel stepped inside after his sister, ducking slightly under the low ceiling. He ran a hand along the wall and came away with flakes of paint clinging to his fingers. "This isn't a fixer-upper, Dad. This is a sinking coffin." Ethan ignored the words and looked deeper into the cabin. His eyes traced the details that others might miss. The way the beam still held firm despite the dampness, the way the steel brackets along the corners had resisted the years better than the wood around them. There was strength beneath the ruin, a foundation waiting to be uncovered. He crouched to examine the bolts on the floor near the table. They're rust-thick, but not yet fatal. Lily's attention was caught by the porthole, the glass clouded but still intact. She placed her fingers against it, smiling faintly at the way the light bent through the cracks. "It feels like it's hiding something," she whispered, half to herself. Her imagination filled the shadows with possibilities. Daniel shook his head, kicking at a corner where mildew crept up from the floorboards. "It's hiding mold, that's what. And rats. Probably a whole colony of them waiting for us to sleep." Ethan straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. He could feel their doubts pressing on him from both sides. The skepticism of his son, the cautious curiosity of his daughter. He knew the boat's condition was bad, maybe worse than he could afford to admit. But as he stood in that cramped cabin, surrounded by the smell of damp wood and the echo of waves outside, something inside him refused to let go. "This is ours now," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "It's not pretty and it's not easy, but it's ours. That means we get to decide what it becomes." Lily looked up at him with wide eyes, her faith unshaken, while Daniel exhaled in frustration, rubbing his temples. The silence stretched, filled only by the creak of the boat shifting against the dock. Outside, the last of the dock workers drifted away, their laughter fading with distance, leaving the Ross family alone with their new burden. The boat groaned, as though acknowledging its new keepers. For Ethan, it was a first step into something unknown, a step that could either anchor them deeper into hardship or pull them toward a future none of them could yet see. The three of them sat on overturned crates near the stern, the evening sun dipping low over the marina and staining the water with streaks of orange and red. The dock had grown quiet as most of the workers drifted home, leaving only the occasional gull circling overhead and the creak of lines pulling against weathered posts. Daniel sat slouched with his arms folded, still wearing the sour expression he had carried since the auction. Lily leaned against the railing, sketchbook balanced on her knees, tracing the curve of the boat's battered hull as if capturing its scars might help her understand it. Ethan rubbed his hands together, staring at the worn deck, knowing he had to explain himself before resentment hardened too deeply in his children's hearts. "I know what you're both thinking," he began, his voice low, almost drowned by the water lapping against the pilings. "That your old man has finally lost it. That I just wasted what little money we had on something that might not even float." He paused, letting the words settle. Daniel muttered something under his breath. But Ethan pressed on. "You're not wrong to be scared. Believe me, I am too." Daniel lifted his head then. Frustration etched across his face. "Then why spend everything on this?" His tone cracked with both anger and fear. "We needed that money for rent, for food, not this wreck." Ethan took a deep breath. He had asked himself the same thing 100 times already, but the answer always came back the same. Because sometimes you don't buy what makes sense on paper. Sometimes you buy what feels like it's waiting for you. He looked out at the water, the horizon shimmering where the sun touched the waves. "I can't explain it perfectly, but when I saw this boat, I knew. It was like it was meant to be ours." Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "Meant to be ours? Dad, it's not some fairy tale. It's a pile of rot. We're going to sink before we even leave the dock." Lily looked up from her sketchbook, her small voice cutting through the tension. "Maybe Dad means it the way I feel when I find a sketch I need to finish. Like it's already part of me, even before it's done." She tilted her head, studying the tired vessel. Maybe the boat was just waiting for someone to see it again. Ethan smiled faintly at her words, then turned back to Daniel. "Your sister's right. Look, I've spent the last few years chasing stability. That never came. Every job, every promise. It all slipped away. I kept trying to play it safe. And what did that get us? Secondhand furniture, late rent notices, and me coming home too tired to talk." His voice thickened with the weight of those failures. "This time, I needed to choose something different. Something that could give us more than just survival." Daniel stared at him, torn between anger and the quiet pull of his father's conviction. He wanted to argue, but deep down he remembered other times his father had taken risks, repairing their old car against all advice, building shelves out of discarded wood when they couldn't afford furniture. Somehow, against odds, those things had worked, even if only for a little while. Ethan placed a hand on the railing, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm. "I can't promise this will work. Maybe I was a fool. But when I looked at this boat, I didn't see rot. I saw a chance. A chance to build something of our own. To stop letting everyone else decide what we get to keep and what we lose." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint tapping of Lily's pencil against her pad. Finally, she closed her sketchbook and leaned against Ethan's arm. "I believe you, Dad." The words were simple, but they eased something heavy inside him. Daniel looked away, his jaw tight, but he didn't protest. That was enough for now. Ethan tightened his arms around both of them as the light faded, the boat rocking gently beneath their weight. The world saw a money pit, but he felt the beginning of something more. It wasn't just a gamble with his last savings. It was a gamble on hope itself. The next afternoon, the marina was quiet, the salty air heavy with the scent of seaweed and diesel. Ethan had borrowed a scraper from a dock worker who, with a half smile, warned him not to bother. "You'll scrape that boat to bones," the man said before walking off. But Ethan ignored the comment, carrying the tool back aboard while Daniel and Lily trailed behind him. The light was soft, the sun caught in drifting clouds, and for a moment the shabby boat looked almost at rest, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to touch its worn surface. Ethan started on one side of the bow, running the edge of the scraper against the faded paint. Chips fluttered down like brittle leaves, scattering across the deck. Daniel leaned against the railing with his arms crossed, muttering about how the work was pointless. "It's just going to reveal more rot, Dad. We should be figuring out how to get rid of it, not dress it up." His voice was tired, edged with the frustration of a boy who had grown too old too quickly. Lily crouched closer, her hair falling across her cheeks as she watched the flakes scatter. She reached out with her fingers, rubbing at a section where the paint clung stubbornly. Something caught her eye beneath the layers. Lines too straight, too deliberate to be the random grain of wood. She pressed harder, her fingernails peeling away thin curls of paint until the edge of a carved letter appeared. "Dad, look!" she whispered, her eyes wide. Ethan leaned closer, squinting at the faint outline. With more deliberate effort, he set the scraper aside and began using the flat of his hand, rubbing the old paint until more letters emerged. Daniel straightened, interest replacing his boredom as the shapes formed into words. Lily worked beside her father, her small hands careful, reverent almost, as if she were uncovering something sacred. The name revealed itself slowly, each stroke pulling the past closer. By the time the last flakes fell, the wooden nameplate gleamed faintly through the grime, its letters carved deep and elegant, unlike anything that belonged on a simple fishing vessel. Aurora's Wake. The words curved gracefully across the bow, their age undeniable, yet their craftsmanship still clear. Lily's face lit up with awe. "It already sounds beautiful," she said softly, tracing the grooves with her fingertips. "Like it had a story before us." Ethan felt a shiver pass through him. The name stirred something faint in his memory, something he couldn't quite place. He exchanged a look with Daniel, whose skepticism gave way to curiosity. "Aurora's Wake," the boy repeated, his tone more cautious and mocking. "That doesn't sound like some random boat. It sounds important." Later, in the small marina office, Ethan flipped through dusty registries with Lily at his side. The clerk on duty, an old man with a weathered cap and a habit of chewing on toothpicks, leaned over the counter when Ethan asked about the name. His brow furrowed as he pulled out a thin binder of records. "Aurora's Wake," he murmured, scanning the pages. "Haven't heard that in years. Belonged to the Pembroke family. If I recall right, they were shipping magnates back in the 30s and 40s. Mysterious bunch. One day they were all over the newspapers. The next they were gone." Ethan felt the weight of the discovery sink into him. This wasn't just a derelict fishing boat, a forgotten wreck abandoned to rust. It had belonged to men of wealth and influence, people who had shaped trade routes and fortunes. To have vanished so suddenly made the boat more than an odd relic. It was a fragment of a larger mystery. Lily's eyes gleamed as she listened. "See, Dad? It was waiting for us." No one else even bothered to look at the name. She clutched her sketchbook, already scribbling the letters with careful strokes. Daniel frowned, unsettled but intrigued. If it was theirs, then why is it rotting here? Why did anyone keep it up? The clerk only shrugged, tapping the edge of the page. Lots of stories in these docks. Some sink with the ships. That night, as the children slept in their cramped apartment above the corner store, Ethan sat at the table with the nameplate etched into his thoughts. He ran his thumb across a scrap of paper where he had written the name, the letters almost glowing under the lamp. Aurora's Wake. The gamble he had taken no longer felt like blind hope. It felt like the first step into a story waiting to be uncovered, one that had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. The afternoon sun had slipped behind a veil of gray clouds, leaving the marina cloaked in a cool dimness. Ethan and his children had returned to the boat after school, carrying with them a few basic tools and the stubborn determination to keep peeling back its secrets. The air inside the vessel was damp, heavy with a must of mildew and brine, a smell that clung to the back of the throat. Ethan carried a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting across the warped floorboards of the lower deck as he led the way down a narrow ladder. The wood creaked under his weight, and Daniel followed reluctantly, muttering that the entire place was a hazard. Lily came last, her sketchbook tucked against her chest, unwilling to leave behind. The lower deck was tighter than they expected, a space cobbled together with beams swollen from water damage. Rust streaked the metal fittings, and in one corner, condensation dripped steadily, collecting in a shallow puddle. Daniel swung the flashlight across the walls, his sharp eyes scanning for anything useful. He wasn't interested in moldy ropes or broken nets. His skepticism didn't keep him from looking, if only to prove the point that there was nothing worth saving here. It was Daniel who noticed it first. Near the stern, behind a stack of warp crates, the light caught on something metallic. He frowned, setting the flashlight down and pushing aside the crates with a grunt. "Dad," he called, his voice low but edged with surprise. Ethan ducked under a beam and joined him, crouching to see what caught his son's attention. There, half hidden beneath years of grime, was a hatch, round and heavy, built into the floor itself, its iron surface pitted with rust. A thick line of corrosion ran around its edge, and as Ethan brushed away the dirt with his hand, he saw the dull glint of welded seams. Whoever had closed it had meant for it to stay closed. Daniel knelt beside him, running his fingers along the edge. "This isn't just stuck," he said, shaking his head. "It's sealed." His voice carried both frustration and intrigue. Why would anyone weld shut a hatch inside their own boat? Ethan pressed his weight against the handle, trying to force it, but the metal didn't even budge. It was as if the sea itself had claimed it, fusing it into the deck for good. He leaned back, wiping sweat and grime from his brow, and tried to steady his breath. "Because whatever's inside wasn't meant to be found," he said quietly, more to himself than to the children. Lily crouched beside them, her eyes wide. She traced one of the weld lines with her finger, her imagination racing ahead. "Maybe it's hiding treasure," she whispered, half serious, half dreaming. "Or maybe something dangerous." Daniel scoffed, though his curiosity betrayed him. "More likely it's hiding rot. Probably the whole bottom is eaten out, and they welded it shut so it wouldn't flood." Yet even as he spoke, he didn't look away from the hatch. Ethan placed his hand on the rusted metal, feeling its chill. The weight of it pressed on him, not just the physical heaviness, but the sense of intention behind it. People didn't weld hatches shut without reason. He thought of the name carved on the bow of the vanished Pembroke family, whose wealth had once commanded fleets. The boat was tied to them somehow, and now here lay a hatch deliberately sealed from view, a hidden chamber waiting beneath their feet. The air felt different in that space, heavier somehow, as though the boat itself was holding its breath. Ethan stood slowly, the beam of the flashlight steady on the corroded circle. "This is why we bought her," he said at last. "Because she's hiding something." Daniel looked up at him, torn between disbelief and reluctant excitement. For all his doubt, he couldn't deny the pull of the mystery. Lily pressed closer to her father, her voice soft but certain. "Then we have to find a way to open it." The three of them stood together in the dim belly of the ship, the sound of water tapping against the hull echoing around them. Above, the dock was quiet, but here below, in the stale air of the lower deck, the sealed hatch waited, patient and silent, guarding whatever truth the Aurora's wake had carried across decades. The rain had started by the time they returned to the boat the next day, a light drizzle that blurred the outlines of the dock and coated every surface with a slick sheen. The marina was nearly deserted, the usual clatter of voices replaced by the steady tap of droplets against tarps and tin roofs. Ethan carried a lantern this time, determined to get a clearer look at the lower deck. Daniel trailed behind, hands shoved deep in his pockets, while Lily skipped carefully along the gangplank, her sketchbook tucked under her jacket to keep it dry. Inside, the damp smell was sharper, the air cool and stale. They had brought rags to wipe down some of the surfaces, and while Ethan inspected the sealed hatch again with a crowbar in hand, Daniel began rummaging through the warped furniture bolted to the cabin floor. Most of it looked ready to collapse, drawers swollen shut, cabinet doors hanging askew. But Daniel's persistence paid off when one of the drawers, after a few sharp pulls, groaned open, releasing a puff of dust and mildew that made him cough. "Dad," he said, pulling something out carefully. It was a book, thick and bound in dark leather that had warped from years of moisture. The cover was cracked, its edges chewed by time, but the spine still held firm. A logbook. Ethan set aside the crowbar and took it in both hands, his thumb brushing over the faded embossing on the front. The words were illegible, but the feel of it was solid, deliberate. He opened it slowly, and the scent of damp paper rose like breath from a tomb. The pages were yellowed and curled. Ink bled in places where water had soaked through, but much of the writing remained legible, the script neat and looping. Lily leaned close, eyes wide as Ethan angled the lantern over the pages. The first entries were dated 1931. They described routes across the Atlantic, shipment of textiles, and visits to ports in Lisbon, Halifax, and Havana. Each day was meticulously recorded, with notes on weather, crew morale, and cargo tallies. It seemed ordinary at first, the routine record of a ship's captain. But as Ethan flipped further, the tone began to change. The later entries grew shorter, the handwriting more hurried. Mentions of delays appeared without explanation. One passage from October 1933 caught his eye. Asterisk voyage postponed. Orders from Pembroke himself. Cargo held in secrecy. Crew restless. Asterisk Ethan read it aloud, his voice low, and Daniel frowned. Cargo held in secrecy? Daniel repeated. What does that even mean? Ethan turned the page. Another entry, this one smudged but still readable. Asterisk no word to men. Pembroke insists silence. Aurora's wake is not to be questioned. Asterisk the word sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Lily traced the letters with her finger, whispering them softly as though tasting their weight. Why would a shipping magnate order secrecy on his own boat? She asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. The further they read, the stranger became. In early 1934, the entries ended abruptly. The last page carried only a single line, written with heavier ink, as if pressed with force. Asterisk the voyage ends before it begins. For those who come after, trust awake. Asterisk. Ethan closed the book slowly, the final words echoing in his thoughts. Trust awake. It wasn't the kind of phrase a captain wrote lightly. He looked at his children, both leaning close, their expressions a mixture of confusion and wonder. This isn't just a log, Ethan said. It's a message. Something happened to this ship. Something that was never explained. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, torn between doubt and fascination. Or maybe he just went crazy. Ships don't keep secrets, Dad. People do. Lily hugged the sketchbook to her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. But what if the boat really was carrying something? What if that's why the hatch is sealed? Ethan ran his hand over cracked leather cover again, the chill of the damp binding seeping into his skin. The logbook was fragile, its pages on the edge of disintegration, yet the words still carried across nearly a century. They were no longer dealing with just an old vessel. They were unraveling a story that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. The rain tapped steadily against the portholes, and the three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the lantern casting their shadows large against the warped walls. Outside, the world passed unaware of what they had uncovered. Inside, beneath peeling paint and rusted bolts, the Aurora's wake had whispered its first real clue. The sound of footsteps on the dock carried through the open hatch before Ethan saw her. Margaret never walked quietly. Her heels struck with sharp certainty, each step a reminder of how far she had climbed in the small town where they had both grown up. Ethan looked up from the lower deck as she appeared at the gangplank, her umbrella snapping shut in the drizzle. Her coat was pressed, her hair neat, and her expression already carried the weight of judgment. "Ethan," she called, her voice edged with exasperation before she had even stepped onto the boat. "I had to hear it from 3 different people at the diner before I believed it. You really bought this wreck." Daniel, who was crouched near the sealed hatch pretending to be busy with a coil of rope, stiffened. Lily froze halfway through sketching one of the portholes. Ethan climbed up to meet his sister on the deck, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I did," he said simply, "and before you start." "There is no before I start," Margaret cut in, sweeping her hand across the deck as if presenting Exhibit A in a courtroom. "Look at this thing. It's falling apart. You don't need to be an inspector to see that." Her voice softened slightly, though her eyes stayed sharp. "Ethan, you're repeating the same patterns. Chasing after hopeless projects, throwing money at things that only sink you deeper." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had expected this visit. The whispers on the dock always made their way back to her. "It's not hopeless," he said. Margaret arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it's a death trap. You don't have the money to repair it. You don't have the time, and you certainly don't have the luxury of gambling your kid's future on a rust bucket." Her words stung, not because they weren't true, but because they echoed every doubt that already haunted him. Daniel glanced up, eyes flicking between his father and aunt, the tension thick in the damp air. Lily lowered her gaze to her sketchbook, her pencil moving faster, as the drawing could shield her from the sharpness in Margaret's tone. "I'm not gambling," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed a flicker of defensiveness. "I'm trying to build something for us. Something that isn't just day-to-day survival." Margaret's laugh was short and humorless. "Build? With what? A substitute teacher's paycheck?" Odd jobs that barely keep you afloat? Ethan, I love you, but you need to stop pretending you're some visionary. You're drowning, and now you've dragged this boat around your neck like an anchor. The words hung heavy. Daniel's face tightened as though he wanted to agree, but he said nothing. Lily finally looked up, her small voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's not just a boat," she said. "It has a name, Aurora's Wake, and it has secrets." Margaret turned to her, surprised by the interruption. "Sweetheart, boats don't keep secrets. Grown men do when they can't admit they've made a mistake." Ethan stepped closer, his voice firmer now. "You don't understand, Margaret. This isn't just me chasing shadows. There's history here. We found journals, records, things that connect this ship to people who mattered." His sister's eyes narrowed, studying his face as if measuring whether he truly believed what he was saying. "History doesn't pay bills, Ethan, and it won't keep a roof over your kids' heads. What happens when the landlord raises the rent again? What happens when you can't afford repairs and the bank comes calling?" The drizzle thickened into rain, pattering against the deck, streaking Margaret's coat, though she ignored it. Ethan felt the weight of her words pressing hard, but he also felt the eyes of his children on him, one doubtful, the other hopeful. He had stood at this crossroad too many times before, letting practicality strangle the smallest spark of possibility. This time he refused. "I can't explain everything yet," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "But I know this boat is different. I can feel it. For once, I'm not walking away just because everyone else thinks I should." Margaret shook her head, water dripping from her umbrella as she raised it again. "You're going to regret this," she said softly, though her tone carried more sadness than anger. "And when you do, I hope it doesn't cost you everything." She left without waiting for a reply, her footsteps fading down the dock. Ethan stood silently, rain soaking through his shirt, his children still beside him. Daniel shifted uneasily, his voice low. "She's not wrong, Dad." Ethan glanced at him, then at Lily, who clutched her sketchbook like a shield. "Maybe not," he said, his eyes on the sealed hatch below deck. "But sometimes being right isn't the same as doing what's necessary." The rain hammered harder against the hull, as if the boat itself was listening, waiting for the family to decide whether they would heed Margaret's warning or keep pressing into the unknown. The marina always grew quiet after dark. The chatter of dock workers, the groan of forklifts, and the clatter of chains faded with the setting sun, leaving only the lapping of water and the distant hum of ships anchored farther out in the bay. That night, Ethan had insisted they stay late, wanted to take stock of the tools they had brought aboard and mark down what repairs might be possible. Daniel had been restless from the start, tapping his foot against the warped deck and reminding his father every few minutes that they had school in the morning. Lily, curled up on a folded blanket near the cabin door, seemed content, her pencil scratching steadily as she drew the shape of the boat from memory. The lantern they had set on the table flickered in the damp air, shadows bending and stretching across the cabin walls. Ethan ran his hands over the logbook once more, studying the spidery handwriting under its fragile light, trying to piece together what the final words meant. Trust the wake. He wanted to believe it was some kind of reassurance, but even as he thought about it, he felt a tightness in his chest that refused to ease. It was Daniel who heard it first. He froze mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the floorboards beneath his feet. "Dad," he said sharply, his voice low, "did you hear that?" Ethan paused, listening. At first there was nothing but the familiar groan of the hull shifting with the tide. Then it came again, a muffled thud, not loud, but distinct, as though someone had shifted deep below them. He set the logbook aside and stood, the lantern casting his face in uneasy light. Lily looked up from her sketchbook, her expression wide-eyed. What was it? Ethan moved toward the ladder, leading to the lower deck, every step measured. "Probably just the tide knocking something loose," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. He descended slowly, the beam of the lantern swinging in arcs against the rusted walls. Daniel followed, unwilling to admit his nerves, but unwilling to stay behind either. Lily stayed at the top of the ladder, gripping the railing tight, leaning down to watch. The air in the lower deck was thicker than before, carrying a sour note that hadn't been there earlier. Ethan shone the light across the floorboards, over the crates stacked along the stern, and down toward the sealed hatch. Nothing moved, yet the sound came again, softer this time but close, like a hollow knock from beneath. Daniel's throat went dry. "It's coming from under the hatch," he whispered. Ethan crouched near the corroded circle of metal, pressing his hand to its cold surface. It didn't tremble, but the air around it seemed to pulse with silence. He lifted the lantern closer, studying the seams where the welding caught the light. The hatch looked impenetrable, as it had before, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something on the other side was pressing back. Then, without warning, a scraping noise slid across the hull. Long and deliberate, like metal dragged against wood, it reverberated through the cramped space. Lily gasped from above, her voice trembling. "Dad, someone's down there." Ethan forced calm into his tone. "There's no one inside. It's impossible." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his words. The Pembroke journals, the abrupt ending of voyages, the deliberate welding of the hatch, all of it pressed into his thoughts, heavy and insistent. Daniel stepped back, his voice rising. "If it's impossible, then what's making that sound? Boats don't just knock from the inside." The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the drip of water and the faint creak of ropes against the dock. The silence was worse, stretching long and unbroken, the kind that made every breath feel too loud. Ethan straightened slowly, gripping the lantern tighter than he realized. "Let's go topside," he said at last, his voice firm. "We've done enough for tonight." He ushered Daniel up the ladder, his hand steady on Lily's back as she scrambled out of the way. Once they were on deck, he pulled a hatch shut behind them, the metallic clang echoing in his ears. They sat in uneasy silence as the rain began again, pattering against the tarps and decks of surrounding boats. Daniel refused to meet his father's eyes, while Lily pressed herself close against Ethan's arm, her sketchbook clutched tight. None of them spoke of what they had heard, but the sound lingered in their minds, a question that refused to rest. The Aurora's wake had shifted that night, not just in its creaking timbers, but in the family's understanding of it. Whatever secrets lay beneath that welded hatch were not relics of the past. They were alive, pressing forward, waiting for the moment to surface. The rain had washed the marina clean by morning, leaving the air sharp with salt and the boards of the dock slick beneath their feet. Ethan guided Daniel and Lily back onto the boat, with little said between them. The memory of the noises from the night before clung to all three of them, unspoken yet heavy, like the dampness that refused to lift from the vessel's timbers. Ethan busied himself near the stern, checking the ropes and the lantern, convincing himself that ordinary work might anchor his thoughts. Daniel leaned sullenly against the rail, earbuds dangling without music, his gaze fixed on the water as though it might provide an answer his father could not. Lily, restless and curious, drifted back into the cabin. The small space smelled of damp plaster and mildew, its faded wallpaper curling away from the corners in tired strips. She traced her hand over the peeling patterns, the once bright floral print now dulled to gray stains. Her eyes caught on a section near the narrow bunk, where the wallpaper bulged slightly. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the brittle texture crumble beneath her touch. A corner of it lifted easily, and with a small tug the paper came free in her hand, revealing the rough wooden planks beneath. It wasn't just plain wood. Scratched into the surface were faint lines, shallow grooves that crossed and curved in purposeful patterns. At first she thought it was damage, the kind left by years of shifting furniture or careless tools. But as the lantern light spilled across it, the markings took shape. A coastline, arcs of routes, symbols clustered in the margins. She caught her breath and called softly, "Dad, come look." Ethan ducked into the cabin, wiping his hands on his jeans. When he saw the wall, his face tightened with something between awe and unease. He lifted the lantern closer, the glow revealing the etchings in sharper relief. "These are charts," he said quietly, running his fingers over the carved lines. Nautical charts, carved right into the bulkhead. Daniel stepped in reluctantly, pulling his hood down. He squinted at the markings, his voice skeptical. Why scratch maps into the wall when you could just keep paper charts? That doesn't make sense. Unless paper could be destroyed, Ethan answered, his tone thoughtful. Unless you needed something hidden, something that would last even if everything else was lost. Lily's eyes glowed with excitement. She pointed at a series of marks clustered along one line. That looks like a string of islands. See? And here, this could be a harbor. Her finger traced a symbol etched deep in the others, a small star carved into the wood. Ethan leaned closer, his thoughts racing. It's a waypoint. Someone marked it as important. But why carve it here, under wallpaper, where no one would find unless they were tearing the cabin apart? The three of them stood in silence, the weight of the discovery filling the cramped space. The groans of the boat seemed louder now, as if the vessel itself was exhaling secrets long kept beneath its skin. Daniel folded his arms, his skepticism faltering. If this really is a map, then what's it pointing to? Another port? A hiding place? Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes lingered on the star, his mind flashing back to the sealed hatch below deck, the logbook with its cryptic words, the echoes in the night. Each clue threaded into the next, forming a pattern he couldn't yet see clearly, but one that was impossible to ignore. "We're not dealing with an ordinary ship," he said finally, his voice low. "The Pembrokes left something behind. They wanted it hidden, and they wanted it to last." Lily pressed her hand against the wall, her small fingers fitting into the grooves of the carved star. "Then maybe it's still out there," she whispered. Daniel shook his head, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Or maybe it's just a dead man's scrawl. People draw maps all the time. Doesn't mean they lead anywhere." Ethan turned toward him, meeting his eyes. "And sometimes they lead to everything." The lantern flame flickered, shadows leaping across the etched lines like waves rolling over the wood. The cabin felt smaller, closer, as if the boat itself was holding its breath. For the first time, Daniel didn't look away. He studied the star again, his brow furrowed, caught between disbelief and the dangerous tug of curiosity. Lily stood quietly between them, certain of one thing even if the others weren't. Aurora's wake wasn't finished telling its story. The day had been long with rain, the kind that came in bursts and then drifted into mist, soaking the dock until it glistened like dark glass. Ethan had thought about waiting for better weather before tackling the hatch again, but Daniel had grown restless, his earlier fear turning into a sharp edge of defiance. He had fetched the crowbar from their small toolkit and carried it below deck without waiting for his father's approval. Lily followed close behind, clutching her lantern in both hands, her eyes wide as though each step into lower deck brought her deeper into a story she wasn't sure she wanted to finish. The hatch sat where it always had, a dull circle of iron pressed into the floor, its welded seams dark and corroded. The air was heavy down there, almost claustrophobic, as though the space itself didn't want to be disturbed. Daniel crouched low, running his hands over the rim, fingers tracing the hardened ridges of the weld. His jaw tightened. "If they wanted it shut this badly," he muttered, "then there's a reason, which means I want to see what they didn't want us to." Ethan stood nearby, his arms crossed, tore between stopping his son and letting him push forward. He understood the impulse, curiosity mixed with anger, the need to prove something, but he also understood how dangerous tamper with old steel could be. "It might not be safe," he warned, his voice steady but carrying no conviction. Daniel wedged the crowbar against the seam and pressed down with his weight. The first attempt barely scraped rust from the edge. He repositioned, gritting his teeth, and tried again. The sound echoed in the tight space, metal groaning against metal, sharp and raw. Ethan took a hesitant step closer, watching the strain on his son's arms, the set of his shoulders. He didn't stop him. Lily shifted nervously, the lantern trembling in her hands. The shadows swayed across the walls like restless figures. "What if it's locked because it's dangerous?" she whispered. "What if it's meant to stay closed?" Daniel grunted, sweat beading along his forehead as he forced the crowbar deeper. "Or maybe it's meant for us to open," he shot back, though his voice carried more determination than belief. With a sudden crack, one of the weld seams snapped, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Lily gasped and stumbled back, the lantern nearly slipping from her fingers. Ethan steadied her, his eyes fixed on the hatch as Daniel pulled harder, the crowbar biting into the rust. Another seam gave way with a screech. The smell that seeped out was old and stale, a breath from a chamber untouched for decades. Finally, with one last wrench, the crowbar tore free and the hatch loosened. Daniel fell back, panting. As Ethan moved forward, crouching to grip the handle that had been hidden beneath the corrosion, he pulled, and slowly, with a reluctant groan, the hatch lifted. A hollow darkness yawned below, the lantern's glow barely penetrating its depth. A set of narrow steps descended into the void. They were blackened but intact. The air that rose carried the smell of damp earth and old iron, thick and unsettling. Ethan lowered the lantern, casting trembling light into the chamber. Crates lined the walls, stacked carefully though dust lay thick over them. The edges were marked with faded stencils, letters and numbers no longer clear. Between them, tarps had been folded and left to rot, and in the corner sat a trunk bound in metal bands. Daniel leaned forward, his earlier skepticism replaced with wide-eyed astonishment. "It's real," he whispered. All this time, something was down here. Lily's voice was small, almost reverent. "It looks like it's been waiting." Ethan stared into the chamber, his heart thudding heavy. For weeks he had lived with the weight of doubt, his own, his sister's, the dock workers, even his son's. But now, staring at the hidden room that had been welded away from the world, he felt a shift. This was no longer just a gamble or a foolish dream. The Aurora's wake had given up its first true secret, and whatever lay in those crates and trunks would tell them why. He looked back at his children, the glow of the lantern painting their faces in gold and shadow. "We've only just begun," he said softly, before lowering himself into the hidden chamber, one step at a time, the darkness swallowing him as the lantern followed. The lantern swayed in Ethan's hand as he descended the narrow steps into the hidden chamber. Each creak of wood beneath his boots echoed louder than it should have, the air stale and unmoving, as though no breath of wind had touched it in nearly a century. Daniel followed close behind, his sneakers slipping slightly on the damp boards, while Lily hesitated at the top before finally gathering the courage to come down, clutching the railing with small, tense fingers. The deeper they went, the stronger the descent became. Damp paper, rust, and something faintly metallic, like coins left too long in seawater. At the bottom, the lantern light revealed walls lined with crates stacked to shoulder height. Dust lay thick across every surface, stirred into the air by their movement, glittering like motes of ash in the trembling glow. Ethan brushed his hand across the nearest crate, his fingertips coming away gray, then leaned closer to examine the faded stencil on its side. The mark was clear enough despite the wear, a merchant insignia, a circle enclosing a stylized P. He frowned. "Pembroke," he murmured. Daniel crouched and pried at the crate's edge with the crowbar he had carried down. The wood resisted, brittle but stubborn, until with a sharp crack one plank splintered away. He pulled another free, then another, until the lantern light spilled across the contents. Inside lay stacks of old newspapers, their edges curled and browned, but the bold headlines still faintly legible. Ethan reached in carefully, lifting one out, the paper fragile in his hands. The date across the top read September 1933. Lily leaned close, her eyes wide. Why would someone hide newspapers? Ethan turned the pages with delicate care. They were all from the same month, all preserved in careful stacks. He shifted through more of the crate, finding bundles of ledgers bound in leather, their covers stained with watermarks but still intact. He placed one on the floor, opening it to rows of neat handwriting in columns of numbers. The names of ports appeared in the margins: Lisbon, Halifax, New Orleans. Each line tied to figures that didn't match any ordinary cargo. Large sums are crossed through with symbols instead of words, coded notations filling the spaces. Daniel bent over the pages, his brows furrowed. This isn't normal bookkeeping. It looks like a code. Another crate, once pried open, held nothing but envelopes sealed with wax, the stamps bearing the same P, insignia. Inside were letters written in a rushed hand, some in English, others in a language Ethan couldn't immediately place. Each ended with the same phrase, scratched as if in warning: "Silence keeps us safe." Ethan's chest tightened as he stacked the findings beside him. These weren't just relics. They were records deliberately hidden. The Pembrokes had sealed them away, and someone had gone so far as to weld shut the hatch to keep them untouched. He thought again of the logbook upstairs, of the abrupt ending, the words "trust awake." Lily picked up one of the fragile newspapers, holding it close to the lantern. Her eyes lingered on a headline about financial collapse, the kind of panic that had swept the globe during the Depression. She looked up at her father, her voice quiet but steady. "Do you think they were hiding money?" Ethan hesitated, staring at the coded ledgers, the sealed letters. "Maybe more than money," he said at last. "Maybe they were hiding everything." The chamber pressing around them, heavy with silence. The lantern flame sputtered, casting long shadows over the crates and ledgers, as if the past itself was stirring awake after decades of confinement. For the first time, Ethan felt the true weight of what they had uncovered. This was not just a forgotten boat, not just a foolish gamble. The Aurora's wake had been chosen as a vault, a keeper of secrets the Pembrokes had never intended to see daylight again. Daniel's voice was hushed, the sarcasm gone from it now. "Dad, what if we're not supposed to have found this?" Ethan met his son's gaze, then looked down at the fragile records spread around them. "We were meant to," he said, though his voice carried a gravity that admitted how dangerous that truth might be. The following morning the fog lay thick across the marina, wrapping the boats and pylons in a heavy gray veil. Ethan had barely slept, his mind turning over the ledgers, the coded letters, the newspapers that had lain untouched in the chamber for nearly a century. He stood at the rail of the Aurora's wake with a mug of bitter coffee, staring into the mist, when the sharp echo of footsteps carried along the dock. They weren't the heavy, familiar strides of fishermen or dockhands. These were measured, deliberate, the kind of steps made by a man used to being heard before he was seen. A tall figure emerged from the fog, his long coat brushing the tops of his polished shoes. He carried himself with an ease that didn't belong among rusted trawlers and sagging nets. The man stopped just short of the gangplank, his gaze sweeping the boat as if he had been searching for it specifically. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, almost warm, but carried an undercurrent of authority. "You must be Mr. Ross." Ethan stiffened, setting down his mug. "Who's asking?" The stranger smiled faintly, as though expecting the question. "Victor Crane. I represent a group interested in waterfront properties. Word is, you picked up this boat at auction a few days back. Bold choice." His eyes traveled the length of the hull, lingering on the spot where the paint had been scraped away to reveal Aurora's wake. Daniel had come up from below deck, his expression guarded, while Lily peeked out from the cabin, hugging her sketchbook tightly to her chest. Ethan stepped closer to the gangplank, his posture protective. "She's not for sale," he said, his tone flat. Crane's smile didn't falter. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Ross. It's just a matter of naming the right price." He reached into his coat and produced a slim leather folio. From it, he withdrew a check already filled out, the amount written in bold, flowing numbers. Ethan's stomach turned when he saw it. Far more than he had paid at auction, far more than the boat could possibly be worth in its present state. Enough to pay off debts, secure rent for years, maybe even buy a proper home again. Daniel's eyes widened, and for a moment he looked at his father with something close to hope. "Dad, that's the lot." But Ethan didn't take the check. He kept his gaze on Crane, searching the man's eyes for intent. "Why this boat?" he asked. There were plenty of others in better shape. Why offer that much for this one? Crane's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, though his tone remained calm. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in preserving certain pieces of history. This vessel has ties that matter to me, and I'd rather see it handled properly than left to decay under your care." Lily stepped forward then, surprising both men. Her voice was small but firm. "You mean you don't want us to find what's inside?" Crane turned his gaze to her, and for a fraction of a second his polished demeanor cracked. He recovered quickly, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Children have such vivid imaginations. Ethan moved slightly to block his daughter from view. "The answer's no," he said. Crane studied him for a long moment, the fog swirling around them, silence stretching thin. Finally, he folded the check back into his folio and slipped it into his coat. "Think it over," he said, his voice quieter now, edged with steel. "This is a generous offer. Most men in your position wouldn't refuse it." He turned and walked back into mist, his footsteps fading, until only the sound of water lapping against the dock remained. Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tightly he had been gripping the rail. Daniel spoke first, his voice tense. "Dad, what if he's right? What if we can't handle this? That money could fix everything." Ethan didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the fog where Crane had vanished, his mind replaying the man's words. Offers that high didn't come without reason. The Aurora's wake held more than just old papers and crates. Someone else knew it and wanted it silenced. The morning after Crane's visit, Ethan found himself restless, pacing the length of the Aurora's wake, while Daniel and Lily lingered near the cabin, their voices low as they argued quietly about whether the boat was worth the trouble. He could still feel the weight of Crane's offer pressing against his mind, that impossible check dangling like bait. It would have been easy to take it, easy to silence all the doubts. But there was something in the man's eyes that unsettled him, something that said Crane wasn't just trying to buy a relic. He was trying to bury something. Ethan needed answers, and the only place he knew to look was with the people who had lived their whole lives on these docks. That afternoon, he walked the length of the marina, past the bait shops and rusting crab pots, until he reached the far end where the older fishermen gathered. They sat on overturned buckets and crates, mending nets by hand, their faces carved by sun and years of salt air. Among them was an old man Ethan had spoken to once or twice, a wiry dockhand named Harlan Pike. His hair was white and sparse beneath a faded cap, and his eyes were pale, almost cloudy, but sharp when they fixed on you. Ethan greeted him carefully. "Mr. Pike, you've been around these docks longer than anyone. I was hoping you might know something about a ship called Aurora's Wake." The old man paused in his work, tying off a knot with fingers that still moved with precision despite their gnarled joints. He looked at Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "Funny you bring that name up. Haven't heard it spoken in years." Ethan crouched beside him, lowering his voice. "I came into possession of her at the auction. She's in rough shape, but she's ours now, and I found some things inside. Old journals, coded ledgers. I need to know what she was used for." Harlan let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "You bought her, huh? Lord help you. Folks used to say the wake wasn't just a freighter. Back in the 30s, she ran what we called midnight cargo. The phrase hung between them. Heavy." Ethan frowned. "Smuggling? More than smuggling," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "She moved things when the world was falling apart. Gold, securities, sometimes people who needed to disappear. Always at night, always under the Pembroke flag. Crews swore they never knew what was in the holds, only that they were paid better than anyone else on the water. But you didn't ask questions on that ship, not if you wanted to keep sailing." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "And what happened? Why did she end up abandoned here?" The old man's eyes clouded further, his voice trailing into something close to reverence. "One winter, she came back from a run and never left the harbor again. Pembroke himself had her locked tight. Rumors spread. Some said she carried something cursed. Others said she was part of a deal gone bad. Men who talked too much about it. Well, they didn't last long around here. After a while, the wake became a ghost ship. Nobody touched her. A gull cried overhead, sharp and lonely, as Ethan let the words settle. Midnight cargo. Hidden runs. Deals carried out in silence. It matched too well with the journals, the coded ledgers, the sealed hatch. He asked carefully, and if someone wanted her now? If they came asking questions? Harlan's thin smile carried no humor. Then they know what she carried isn't finished haunting us. You be careful, Ross. Some things are hidden for good reason. Ethan thanked him quietly, though the words felt small against the weight of what he'd just heard. As he walked back toward the Aurora's wake, the boards of the dock groaning underfoot, he saw Daniel and Lily waiting for him at the gangplank. Daniel's face was tight, suspicion written across his features, while Lily clutched her sketchbook as though it were a shield. What did he say? Daniel asked. Ethan looked from his son to his daughter, then back to the vessel looming behind them, its nameplate glinting faintly in the gray light. He said the weight carried things no one was supposed to see, things that could ruin men, and someone doesn't want us finding out what they were. Daniel swallowed hard, his earlier doubts shifting into something darker. Lily's eyes widened, caught between fear and wonder. The fog rolled in heavier then, curling around the boat as though the pass itself was drawing near. The rain had passed by evening, leaving the sky bruised with low clouds and the water restless under a shifting wind. Ethan lit the lanterns again, their soft glow filling the cramped cabin with an amber haze. The three of them had decided to return to the hidden chamber beneath the hatch. Despite the unease that stirred in all of them, the ledgers and newspapers had been stacked neatly on the table above, but the crates still filled the chamber below, their contents waiting to be uncovered. Ethan descended first, lantern in hand, his boots thudding softly on the narrow steps, while Daniel followed with a crowbar slung casually across his shoulder. Lily trailed behind them, her sketchbook pressed against her side, though her eyes were fixed on the shadow corners where secrets seemed to breathe. The air was cool and stale as before, heavy with the scent of rust and damp wood. Ethan set the lantern on a crate and pried open another box with careful pressure, his hands moving slow, deliberate, as though the wood itself might protest being disturbed. Inside were smaller objects, wrapped in cloth yellow with age. He unwrapped one bundle to reveal a stack of coins, dull with tarnish, their inscriptions worn but faintly visible. He turned one over in his palm, feeling its surprising weight, before setting it aside. While her father and brother studied the coins, Lily wandered deeper into the chamber. Her small fingers brushed along the tops of the crates, the rough dust clinging to her skin. One box in the far corner seemed lighter than the rest, its lid already cracked. She leaned closer and tugged gently at the loose plank until it came free with a sigh of splinters. Inside, beneath more scraps of rotted cloth, something gleamed faintly in the lantern light. She reached in and lifted it out carefully. A brass compass, its surface tarnished but not broken, the glass cracked yet still holding its shape. "Dad," she called softly, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Ethan turned, the lantern catching the glint in her hands. Daniel rolled his eyes. "It's just a compass. Everyone had those back then." But it wasn't. As Lily held it flat on her palm, the needle spun slowly, not snapping north as it should have, but circling with a strange patience, pausing, then circling again. Ethan stepped closer, frowning. "That's not right." Lily tilted the compass slightly, watching as the needle steadied, not north, but toward the starboard side of the hull. She turned her wrist, expecting it to adjust back, but the needle resisted, twitching only to return to the same point. Daniel stepped closer now, curiosity edging past his sarcasm. "It's broken," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. Ethan took it gently from Lily's hand, holding it level. The needle swung again, then froze, pointing to a section of the chamber wall, where steel ribs curved behind the wooden planks. He tapped the hull with his knuckle, and the sound came back dull, hollow. He tapped again farther down and heard the solid thud of filled wood. The difference was unmistakable. "There's something behind here," he said quietly. Daniel crouched, pressing his ear to the panel. "It's like there's space behind it." His eyes flicked up to his father, a mix of excitement and unease flickering there. "You think this was what they were hiding?" Lily hugged her sketchbook tightly, her small voice trembling but steady. Maybe the compass was meant to find it. Ethan stared at the panel, then back at the odd compass in his hand. A tool from another time, built to guide ships across oceans, now leading them to secrets inside the very bones of the Aurora's wake. He felt the weight of history pressing closer, the Pembroke silence thick in the air, and yet something else as well, a sense that the ship itself wanted its story uncovered, piece by piece. The lantern flame flickered, shadows deepening across the steel lines of the hull. Ethan placed the compass carefully on the crate beside him, his mind already racing with questions. Why hide a compartment within a compartment? Why leave behind a tool that would lead only the boldest or most desperate to find it? The wake was not just a vault for relics. It was a puzzle, one that seemed to be drawing them deeper into its secrets whether they were ready or not. The morning had broken with a strange brightness, the kind that promised change in the air. The clouds were low and restless, sliding across the sky like dark sails, but Ethan had decided it was time to test the Aurora's wake on the water. They could not keep her tethered forever, and if she was going to become theirs in truth, they needed to see how she moved beyond the dock. Daniel had argued that the hull wasn't ready, that they didn't even know if the engine would hold, but Ethan's determination pressed heavier than caution. Lily, with her usual quiet eagerness, had sided with her father, her small voice saying it was better to know than to wonder. By midday, they had coaxed the engine into life. It coughed and roared, then settled into a shuddering rhythm that shook the deck beneath their feet. Ethan guided the boat out into the open water, his hand steady on the wheel. The wind was already picking up, tugging at their jackets and snapping loose ropes against the rails. Daniel stood near the stern, his arms braced against the railing, watching the dock recede into the mist. Lily stayed close to Ethan, her sketchbook tucked safely away, her wide eyes fixed on the wave that rolled higher as they ventured farther out. The first gust struck them suddenly, a wall of wind that sent spray crashing over the deck. The Aurora's wake groaned, her old timbers flexing under the strain, but she pushed forward. Ethan narrowed his eyes against the stinging salt and adjusted the wheel, but the sea was no longer theirs to control. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, the light dimming until horizons seemed to vanish. Waves rose, each one larger than the last, lifting the boat and dropping it with shuddering crash. Daniel shouted over the roar of water, his voice edged with panic. "We have to turn back. She's not built for this anymore." Ethan's knuckles whitened on the wheel. "Hold on," he barked, his own voice straining against fear. He tried to angle the bow into the waves, but the boat lurched violently to one side, sending Lily sprawling against the rail. Ethan lunged and caught her arm, pulling her upright as another swell smashed against the hull. Water poured over the deck, swirling around their feet. The storm closed in with startling speed, rain lashing against them in sheets. Lightning flared in the distance, followed by a rumble that seemed to shake the very air. The Aurora's wake heaved again, nearly tipping, and Daniel clutched the railing with both hands, his face pale. "We're going under," he cried. Ethan knew they couldn't ride it out on the deck. His mind leapt to the chamber below, the space that had waited sealed for decades. "Below," he shouted. "Get below now." They stumbled down the ladder, water dripping in torrents through the hatch above. The sealed chamber loomed like a refuge, its crates and shadows strangely steady against the chaos outside. Ethan shoved the hatch shut behind them, the metallic clang muffled by the roar of the storm above. For the first time, the hidden room felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. The three of them huddled together among the crates, the lantern trembling in Ethan's hand. The hull moaned with the weight of the waves, the sound of each impact vibrating through the steel panels. Daniel pressed his back against the wall, his breath coming fast. "This place was welded shut for a reason," he muttered. "Maybe they hid here too." Lily clung to her father's arm, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's keeping us safe now." Ethan looked around at the chamber, at the coated ledgers and forgotten crates stacked like sentinels of another age. The Pembrokes had sealed away to guard their secrets, but in this moment it guarded something far more fragile, his family. The storm battered at the boat, but within the steel and with the hidden room, they endured, listening to fury outside as if it belonged to another world. When the storm finally eased, it left the Aurora's wake rocking in the gray aftermath, the sky still bruised but breaking in thin streaks of pale light. Water dripped steadily from the beams, pooling on the warped boards of the lower deck. Ethan had led them up for air as soon as the waves calmed, and they stood in silence for a long while, breathing in the damp chill, shaken but grateful that the boat had held. The sealed chamber below, once a source of unease, had protected them. It had swallowed the sound of the storm like a vault. Later, when the sea had settled into a tired roll, and the world outside seemed safe again, Daniel returned to the chamber. He wasn't ready to leave it alone. The storm had pressed him close to the crates and walls, and during one crash of thunder, he had noticed something odd, a difference in the way the wood responded under his back. Now, with the lantern lit again, he began testing that memory. He tapped the planks with his knuckles, moving from one end of the wall to the other. Most gave a solid, stubborn sound, the noise would thick with age. But when he reached the section tucked behind a heavy stack of crates, the knock rang out differently, hollow, as though there was more space beyond. "Dad," he called. His voice hushed, though urgency sharpened it. Ethan appeared at the ladder a moment later, Lily close on his heels. Daniel struck the wall again, letting the sound echo. "Hear that?" Something's behind here. Ethan frowned, setting the lantern down and pressing his ear to the boards. He knocked as well, listening. The sound was unmistakable, a cavity where none should exist. He drew back, his face unreadable. "Help me move these crates." Together they dragged him aside, the wood groaning against the floor, sending up clouds of dust that clung to their throats. Lily coughed softly but refused to leave, her eyes fixed on the wall, as if she were watching a curtain about to be pulled back. When the last crate was shoved clear, they stood before a section of boards slightly misaligned, their edges too neatly cut. Daniel ran his hand along the seams, feeling the narrow gap where one board met another. "It's a false wall," he said, his voice low with awe. Ethan retrieved the crowbar, prying carefully at the boards. They resisted at first, creaking as if reluctant to give up their secret, but slowly one loosened, then another. The lantern light slipped into the gap, spilling onto something beyond. Ethan pulled harder, until at last a section gave way, the wood clattering to the floor. Behind the false wall lay another chamber, narrower and darker than the first. The air that seeped out was colder, thick with the scent of oil and rust. They raised the lantern higher, and shapes emerged in the gloom, more crates, smaller and sturdier, stacked with precision. Along the wall gleamed the faint outlines of metal fittings, unlike anything in the rest of the vessel. Lily clutched her sketchbook tightly, her voice a whisper. "It's like another ship inside this one." Daniel's eyes were wide, his earlier skepticism drowned out by the thrill of discovery. He stepped closer, reaching for one of the smaller crates, his hands trembling despite himself. Ethan put a steady hand on his shoulder. "Careful," he warned. For a long moment they stood in silence, the lantern casting their shadows large against the walls. The Aurora's wake had revealed its second chamber, a place no one outside the Pembroke Circle had likely ever seen. The first room had been a vault for records and coded messages, but this hidden hollow promised something more, something the family had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. "Whatever's in here," he said quietly, "this is what they wanted no one to find." The air in the second chamber was colder, the kind of cold that seeped from stone cellars and abandoned vaults. Ethan lifted the lantern higher, the flame trembling in its glass, throwing nervous light across the crate stacked neatly against the hidden wall. Unlike the weathered boxes in the first chamber, these were built stronger, with iron reinforcements at the corners and lids fastened with heavy clasps. Dust clung thick to every surface, but the metal fittings had resisted time, their dark sheen intact. The room felt different, less like a storage space and more like a treasury designed to endure. Daniel stepped forward first, his earlier hesitation replaced by the stubborn pull of curiosity. He pried at one of the clasps with a crowbar until it snapped free, the sound echoing sharply in confined space. Together, he and Ethan lifted the lid, both men bracing themselves as though expecting something volatile to spill out. Instead, the crate was filled with books, ledgers bound in leather, their covers marked with a symbol Ethan recognized immediately. It was the same insignia they had seen carved into stone at the mansion, a sigil belonging to the Preservation Brotherhood. The sight of it here, on this boat, tied the Aurora's wake to the same shadowed legacy that had nearly destroyed another family. Ethan's stomach tightened as he lifted one of the books from the crate, brushing the dust from its surface. The leather cracked under his touch, but the binding held. He opened it slowly, revealing rows of careful handwriting, numbers inscribed in deliberate columns, transactions recorded in secret. Each page was a map of money moving unseen, large sums shifted between banks, offshore accounts, and shipping manifests that bore no resemblance to legitimate trade. Names appeared in the margins, some crossed out, others annotated with strange symbols. Ethan traced his finger over them, his breath shallow. "These aren't just shipping records," he said softly. "They're tracking something much bigger. Investments, holdings." Entire fortunes moved in silence. Daniel leaned over his shoulder, eyes narrowing as he tried to follow the patterns. So this brotherhood, whoever they were, they used the boat to hide all this? Why not a bank vault? Ethan closed the ledger, staring at the symbol on the cover. Because banks collapse. Banks get raided or questioned or burned down. But the ship can vanish. You hide your wealth on the water, and it's wherever you need it to be, until you seal away like they did here. Lily stood close, clutching her sketchbook against her chest, her eyes wide as she studied the rows of crates. It's like the boat was a moving safe, she whispered, like it was keeping secrets alive when everything else was falling apart. Ethan set the ledger aside and reached for another, this one heavier. Its pages filled not only with numbers but with letters written in code. Some were in languages he didn't recognize, others in shorthand. So cryptic, it was little more than symbols. Yet every book carried the same mark of the Brotherhood, stamped like a seal of ownership. The silence in the chamber felt denser with each discovery. Ethan could almost hear the echoes of the men who had locked these away, their voices murmuring oaths in the dark. He thought of the mansion, of the Brotherhood's obsession with preserving power across generations, and realized the Aurora's wake had been another part of the same design. Not just a ship, not just a vault, an ark built to carry wealth, records, and influence across storms both real and political. Daniel's voice broke the silence, low but firm. If Crane knows about this, if he knows what's in here, he won't stop. He's not just after some broken boat. He's after this. Ethan met his son's eyes, seeing the fear there but also the clarity. For all the arguments and doubts, Daniel understood now that the gamble wasn't just his father's dream. It was a responsibility, one that reached back nearly a century and forward into whatever danger would come next. Lily pressed closer to them, her small hand finding Ethan's sleeve. "Then we can't let him have it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan looked around at the ledgers stacked in their iron-bound crates. The legacy of men who had believed their secrets would outlast time itself. The Brotherhood had tried to bury their wealth beneath layers of silence, but now it had surfaced again. The wake had chosen its keepers, and they were standing in its shadows, the weight of history settling onto their shoulders. By the end of the week, word had spread beyond the dockside whispers. Ethan's decision to pour his last savings into the Aurora's wake had made its way through the family grapevine, and it wasn't long before they came. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, when the tide was low and the air thick with the smell of seaweed drying along the rocks. Ethan had been bent over the rail, scrubbing away mildew from the deck, when he heard his name carried sharp across the dock. He turned and saw Margaret leading the way, her coat buttoned tightly against the wind, followed by two cousins he hadn't seen in months. Their faces were set in the same tight expressions, their eyes already filled with judgment. They didn't bother with greetings. Margaret stopped short of the gangplank, arms crossed, her voice cutting. "This has gone far enough. Ethan, you need to sell this thing before it swallows you whole." Daniel and Lily had been sitting near the cabin, but they froze at her words, their eyes darting between their father and aunt. Ethan straightened slowly, setting aside the brush in his hand. "It's not for sale." The taller cousin, Alan, stepped forward, his voice heavy with disdain. "You can't afford this boat. You can't afford the repairs. You can't afford the dock fees. And you sure as hell can't afford the risk. Everyone in town's talking about how you've lost your mind again." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Margaret pressed on. "You've dragged your children into a death trap. This hull is rotting. The storms will tear it apart. And for what? Some fantasy you can't even explain." Her voice rose with each word, and Lily flinched, her small hands gripping her sketchbook tightly against her chest. Daniel looked away, shame coloring his cheeks, though not at his father, at the way their family aired wounds so easily in public. Ethan stepped closer to the gangplank, his voice firm though his heart pounded. "You don't understand. There's more to this ship than you think." Margaret laughed, though it carried no humor. "More? More debt? More embarrassment? You've always done this, Ethan. Chasing projects, chasing dreams, dragging everyone with you until it all collapses. This isn't noble. It's reckless." Alan added, "Take the money Crane offered. Everyone knows he's serious. He'll pay you more than the thing's worth. You could walk away today with enough to keep your kids comfortable for years." The mention of Crane made Ethan's stomach turn. He studied their faces, his sister's sharp with frustration, his cousin's lined with practicality. None of them had been there when the sealed chamber opened, when the ledgers breathed history into the air, when the compass spun towards secrets locked inside the hull. None of them had heard the storm batter against the walls while the hidden vault kept them safe. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "You don't get it. We found things. Important things." He stopped there, glancing nervously at Ethan, as if unsure how much to reveal. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Found things? What kind of nonsense are you filling his head with now?" Ethan took a slow breath, fighting the urge to argue, to spill everything just to prove he wasn't a fool. Instead, he steadied his voice. "The wake has a story, a history that matters, and I won't sell it, not to Crane, not to anyone." Silence stretched, broken only by the slap of water against the dock. Margaret shook her head, disappointment heavy in her gaze. "You're going to regret this," she said quietly, echoing the words she had spoken before. "And when you do, I hope it doesn't cost your children the future they deserve." She turned sharply, her coat whipping in the wind as she walked away, the cousins following behind. Their footsteps faded down the dock, but the sting of their words lingered, heavier than the storm that had nearly capsized them days before. Ethan looked back at his children. Lily's eyes were bright with unshed tears, her small frame tense. Daniel's face was shadowed, torn between the logic of his aunt's words and the strange conviction of what he had seen inside the hidden chambers. Ethan moved toward them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "We'll prove them wrong," he said quietly, though whether it was promise or plea, even he wasn't certain. The boat creaked beneath them, as if agreeing, as if reminding them that its secrets had not yet finished unfolding. The wind carried the sharp scent of salt, and eye in the morning, she appeared on the dock. Ethan had been kneeling on the deck, scrubbing mildew from the rail, while Daniel tinkered with the engine below and Lily sketched in her notebook near the cabin door. The footsteps were different from the ones they had grown used to, neither the heavy stride of dockhands nor the cautious shuffle of curious neighbors. These steps were brisk, purposeful, accompanied by the faint click of heels against damp wood. When Ethan looked up, he saw a woman standing at the edge of the gangplank, her coat pulled tight against the breeze, her eyes bright with the alertness of someone who lived on questions. She introduced herself without hesitation. "Professor Claire Whitlock, University of Portsmouth. Maritime History, 20th Century. I believe you're Mr. Ross." Her tone was polite but firm, the sort of voice used commanding the attention of lecture halls and crowded symposiums. She carried a leather satchel at her side, already bulging with papers, and her gaze roamed over the Aurora's wake with an intensity that made Ethan instinctively protective. He rose to his feet slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That's me. What brings a historian from Portsmouth all the way out here?" Professor Whitlock's lips curved into something between a smile and a knowing smirk. Whispers traveled quickly among those who listened for them. "Word reached me that you uncovered something unusual inside this vessel. Ledgers, perhaps? Records tied to the Pembroke family?" Daniel appeared at the hatch, his suspicion plain. "Who told you that?" "Boats talk," she said simply, her eyes flicking toward the hull as though she meant it literally. "And so do dockhands. It doesn't take much for the right details to find the right ears." She adjusted her satchel. "If you allow me aboard, I can help you understand what you found." Ethan hesitated. Crane's sudden interest had already taught him to be wary of strangers, but there was something different about this woman. Her curiosity wasn't coated in greed, but in the urgency of scholarship. Still, he studied her carefully before nodding. "Come aboard, Professor. But understand, this ship belongs to my family. Anything inside it is ours to protect." "Of course," she replied, stepping lightly across the gangplank and onto the deck. Her hand brushed the rail as she moved, her eyes scanning every detail as though cataloging the vessel's scars. "The Aurora's wake," she murmured, tasting the name. "I never thought I'd see her with my own eyes." Lily perked up at that, closing her sketchbook. "You've heard of her?" Whitlock crouched to meet the girl's gaze. "Every serious maritime historian has. She disappeared from the records in 1934. No final voyage log, no decommissioned papers, no sail. She simply stopped existing. On paper, at least. We've suspected for decades that she was part of the Preservation Brotherhood's network, but without proof, she remained a rumor." Ethan stiffened at the name. He had only recently begun to piece together its meaning from the ledgers. To hear it spoken aloud by a stranger brought both relief and unease. "You know about the Brotherhood?" "I know enough to be careful," Whitlock said. "They were financiers, smugglers, archivists, men who believed they were safeguarding civilization by hoarding its wealth and knowledge. Your ship was one of their arks, Mr. Ross. You didn't just buy a boat at auction. You bought a chapter of hidden history." Daniel folded his arms, still skeptical. "And what does that mean for us?" Whitlock's eyes softened, though her words were grave. "It means others will come. Men like Victor Crane don't chase derelict vessels for nothing. The ledgers you found are priceless not because of the money they record, but because of the power they represent. Entire fortunes, hidden alliances, transactions that governments pretended not to see. The Brotherhood wanted this ship forgotten. And if Crane is who I suspect, he wants to make sure it stays that way." The deck fell silent, the gulls wheeling overhead the only sound. Lily's fingers tightened around her sketchbook. Daniel's suspicion had given way to unease. Ethan looked at Whitlock, weighing her words, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. The Aurora's wake had chosen him, but now it seemed history itself had placed him in the crosshairs of something far larger than they had imagined. The cabin felt smaller with Professor Whitlock inside, her satchel open on the table beside the lantern. The smell of salt and mildew clung to the walls, and the sound of water lapping against the hull carried faintly through the floorboards. Ethan sat across from her, his arms folded, while Daniel leaned against the doorframe, skeptical but unable to keep from listening. Lily perched on the bench beside her father, sketchbook resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on the historian with quiet intensity. Whitlock carefully laid one of the ledgers open on the table. Her fingers, slender and ink-stained, traced the faded numbers as though she had studied such scripts her entire life. "You've stumbled onto something extraordinary," she said, her voice calm but weighted. The Aurora's wake wasn't just a freighter. She was chosen to carry assets, vast sums, offshore during the darkest years of depression. Ethan frowned. "Assets? You mean money?" "More than money," Whitlock replied. She turned a page, revealing columns of coded entries. Gold reserves, stock certificates, bearer bonds, items that could survive market collapse if kept beyond the reach of regulators. The Preservation Brotherhood believed they were safeguarding civilization's wealth until order returned. But what they really did was hoard it, moving fortunes across oceans in silence. Daniel pushed off the doorframe, crossing the small space to lean over the ledger, his brow furrowed as he scanned the neat rows of figures. "But why hide them on a boat? Wouldn't a vault be safer?" "Not during those years," Whitlock answered, her tone patient. "Banks failed every day. Governments seized assets, markets imploded. A vault could be raided, but a ship could vanish from the records. It could sail anywhere, disappear into any harbor, and no one would know what it carried." She tapped a finger against the ledger, her eyes gleaming. The Aurora's wake was one of those vessels, an ark of sorts. The Pembrokes were entrusted with moving the Brotherhood's reserves offshore into holding until it was safe to bring them back. But something changed. The record stopped suddenly, as you've seen. My guess is the Pembrokes decided to seal everything away. Whether to keep it safe or to keep it for themselves, I can't say. Ethan sat back, absorbing her words. He thought of the sealed hatch, the false wall, the crates stacked in careful rows. It all fit together now, not random clutter, but deliberate concealment. The wake had been transformed into a floating vault. Lily's small voice broke the silence. Then it wasn't just a boat, it was a guardian. Whitlock's eyes softened as she looked at her. Yes, and guardians carry burdens. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, torn between awe and fear. If what you're saying is true, then those ledgers don't just show numbers. They show power. Whole families could be tied to this. Maybe even governments. Whitlock nodded slowly. Exactly. And that's why Crane came. He doesn't want a relic. He wants control of what's inside. If he acquires these records, he can trace the assets, or bury them forever. Either way, he wins. Ethan exhaled, the truth pressing down like the storm that had battered them days before. His gamble had brought them more than a derelict boat. It had brought them into the orbit of secrets men would still kill to protect. He looked at his children, Daniel with his growing unease, Lily with her unwavering faith, and knew there was no turning back. Whitlock closed the ledger gently, as though sealing away its voice for the moment. You must decide carefully, Mr. Ross. The wake chose you, but the Brotherhood's shadow is long. What you do with this knowledge will decide whether it protects or destroys you. The lantern flame trembled, casting their faces into shifting light. Outside, the tide swelled against the hull, steady and insistent, as if the sea itself was reminding them that the Aurora's wake still carried its secrets, and those secrets were not done shaping the course of their lives. The knock came not with knuckles, but with the hard scrape of a cane against the metal rail, sharp enough to draw all three of them out of the cabin at once. Victor Crane stood on the dock, the mist curling around him like smoke. He wasn't alone this time. A man in a dark suit carried a briefcase, and another, broad-shouldered, silent, hovered just behind, the kind of presence meant to unsettle without a word spoken. Crane himself looked perfectly composed, his coat buttoned, his gloves spotless, as though the damp air had no claim on him. "Mr. Ross," he called, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "We need to have another conversation. This time, I brought clarity." Ethan moved to the gangplank, his jaw set. Daniel appeared at his shoulder, tense, while Lily peeked out from behind the cabin door. Professor Whitlock, who had been reviewing the ledgers with them, stepped quietly into view, her eyes narrowing at Crane, but her face calm. Crane gestured to the man with the briefcase, who snapped it open with a practiced flick and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "You see," Crane began, "this vessel may have been sold at auction, but her status is not as simple as you imagine. Maritime law is quite clear on matters of salvage and abandonment. The Aurora's wake was never properly decommissioned. Technically, she remains abandoned property. That means any claim of ownership is questionable." He extended the folder across the gangplank, his smile tight. "I have already filed paperwork asserting salvage rights. By law, I am entitled to her and everything within her hull." Ethan didn't take the folder. His fists clenched at his sides. "That's not how it works. I bought her fair and square. Paid what was asked." Crane's smile thinned further. Auctions are not always legitimate when the legal status of the goods is contested. You may have bought the illusion of ownership, but illusions do not hold up in court. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And make no mistake, Mr. Ross, I am more than prepared to take this to court. You'll find the cost of fighting me far exceeds whatever pride keeps you tied to this wreck." Daniel bristled, his voice sharp. "You can't just walk in here and take what isn't yours." Crane turned his gaze on him, almost pitying. "Young man, possession means nothing without law, and law, unfortunately, favors those who understand how to wield it." It was Whitlock who finally stepped closer, her presence commanding. "And you think you can wield it without opposition? I've read those ledgers. I know exactly what ties the Aurora's wake to the Brotherhood. Do you really want those names dragged into the light? Do you think their descendants would thank you for unearthing what their grandfathers hid?" For the first time, Crane's composure faltered, a shadow crossing his face. He recovered quickly, straightening his coat, but the pause was telling. "Professor Whitlock," he said evenly, "you should know better than to bluff with half-truths. The Brotherhood is a ghost, and ghosts hold no power." Whitlock's eyes did not waver. Ghosts can still haunt, and some ghosts still have heirs. Crane's jaw tightened. He glanced back at his men, then returned his gaze to Ethan. "I'll give you one more chance. Sign over the vessel voluntarily, and I will ensure you are compensated generously. Resist, and I'll bury you under legal proceedings until you beg me to take her off your hands." Ethan's voice was steady, though his heart pounded. "This boat isn't leaving my family. Not now, not ever." Crane's smile returned, cold and sharp. He closed the folder with a snap and tucked it back into the briefcase. "Then we'll do this the hard way." He tapped his cane against the dock, a sharp sound that echoed like a gavel. "Enjoy your time aboard, Mr. Ross. It will be brief." He turned and walked into the mist, his men following, their footsteps fading but leaving behind a silence heavier than the storm that had nearly capsized them. Ethan stood frozen at the rail, his children close beside him, Whitlock's gaze steady but grim. They all understood now that the Aurora's wake was no longer just a mystery to unravel. It was a battleground, and the fight had only begun. The storm of Crane's visit had barely settled when Lily returned to the objects they had uncovered, her curiosity pulling her back toward the compass she had found days before. The brass casing was tarnished and cracked, yet something about it held her attention in a way the ledgers and newspapers did not. She turned it over in her hands as she sat on the cabin floor, her back against the wall, the lantern flickering beside her. The needle inside continued its strange behavior, spinning lazily, never fixing the true north, always pulling back toward the hull. She pressed her thumb along the rim, feeling the fine etching in the metal, when a faint click answered her touch. Her eyes widened. It was subtle, almost too soft to notice, but the sound had come from within the compass itself. She pressed again, and the casing shifted slightly, revealing a hairline seam that hadn't been visible before. "Dad," she whispered, then louder, "Dad, come look." Ethan and Daniel came quickly, Whitlock following with cautious curiosity. Lily held the compass out in both hands, her small fingers trembling. "It opens," she said, pointing to the seam. Ethan took it carefully, testing the rim. With a gentle twist, the brass cover gave way, snapping open to reveal a hidden compartment beneath the needle. Folded tightly inside, yellowed with age, was a scrap of paper no larger than a playing card. Daniel leaned in, his skepticism slipping into awe. There was something hidden in it all along. Ethan unfolded the paper with care, the fragile fibers threatening to crumble. Spread flat beneath the lantern, it revealed not numbers or words, but a simple sketch, the outline of a ship drawn from above. Key parts were marked in faint ink, most of them familiar: the deck, the bow, the cabin. But near the stern, where the engine room was located, a small box had been drawn, outlined in heavy strokes. Next to it, a symbol had been etched, the same Brotherhood sigil they had seen on the ledgers. Whitlock leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "It's a map, not of the sea, but of the vessel itself." They weren't only hiding cargo below deck. They built an entirely separate chamber within the engine room. Ethan's pulse quickened as he studied the sketch. He could picture the area exactly, the cramped space where the machinery sat, rusted and groaning. He had spent hours there already, trying to coax the engine into life. Never once had he imagined there might be more hidden behind its walls. Daniel straightened, excitement sparking through his doubt. So the compass wasn't broken. It was designed to lead to this. Lily clutched her sketchbook tightly, her voice soft but certain. "It was waiting for us to find it." The cabin fell silent, except for the creak of the boat against its moorings. Ethan felt the weight of the discovery pressing down, heavier than any storm. If the Brotherhood had gone to such lengths to conceal this chamber, what lay behind the steel walls must be far greater than ledgers or faded newspapers. Crane's sudden determination made sense now. He knew, or at least suspected, that the wake's true secret had yet to be uncovered. Ethan folded the map carefully and returned it to the compass, snapping the hidden compartment shut. He looked at his children, then at Whitlock, whose gaze was steady, her expression grave. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we see what's behind that engine." The lantern flickered as though stirred by breath, the shadows shifting across the cabin walls. Outside, the tide pressed harder against the hull, as if the sea itself understood that the Aurora's wake was about to give up the last of its secrets. The engine room was cramped and dim, its air heavy with the mingled scents of rust, oil, and seawater. The lantern Ethan carried cast long, wavering shadows over machinery, illuminating the rusted pipes and corroded valves that lined the walls. The steady thrum of the old engine had gone quiet since Daniel shut it down earlier, leaving only the creak of the hull and the drip of water echoing through the confined space. All eyes were on the stern bulkhead, the very section the hidden map had marked. Ethan set the lantern down on a steel beam, its glow catching the worn edges of bolts and rivets. Daniel crouched first, tapping the metal with the crowbar. The sound rang hollow in places where it should have been solid. He looked up at his father, his expression a mix of fear and thrill. "It's here," he said, his voice low. Ethan nodded, setting his jaw. "Then let's open it. Together." Father and son worked at the seams, prying at rivets that had not been touched in decades. The metal resisted with a groan, as though reluctant to surrender. Lily stood close by, her hands clasped tightly around her sketchbook, her wide eyes reflecting the lantern light. Professor Whitlock observed in silence, her face taut with anticipation. Every movement catalogued in her mind as though it would one day become a line in one of her lectures. At last, with a wrenching shriek, a section of the panel gave way, revealing darkness beyond. Cold air seeped out, carrying with it the musty scent of paper preserved against time. Ethan lifted the lantern and peered inside. It wasn't another chamber like the false wall below, but a vault built directly into the skeleton of the ship, lined with steel to keep it sealed. Inside sat containers, sturdy metal cases, their surfaces dull but intact. Each was stamped with the same sigil that marked the ledgers, the emblem of the Brotherhood. Ethan climbed in first, the space tight around him, and pulled one of the containers free. The clasps were stiff, but with a firm tug, they snapped open. Inside, bundled in neat rows, lay stacks of documents sealed in wax sleeves. Ethan slid one free and held it under the lantern. The bold print across the top made his breath catch. Asterisk United States Maritime Bonds, 1932. Asterisk perfectly preserved. The paper as crisp as the day it had been sealed. Daniel leaned closer, his disbelief plain. These are worth. I don't even know how much. Ethan set the bond aside and reached deeper. The next container opened to reveal rolls of parchment tied with ribbon. Stock certificates from companies long since merged or collapsed, but still carrying value if validated. Underneath them lay pouches of gold coins, their edges glinting in the dim light. Ethan lifted one, the weight heavy and undeniable in his palm. The gleam of real metal silenced them all for a moment. Lily's whisper broke it. It's treasure. Whitlock shook her head slowly, her voice reverent. It's more than treasure. It's power. These bonds and certificates, these coins, they represent not just wealth, but survival. The Brotherhood preserved them, so their influence could outlast any collapse. And here they've been, waiting. Ethan looked at the containers stacked neatly around them, each one carrying more of the same. The scale of it was staggering. What he had thought was a foolish gamble, mocked by neighbors and scorned by family, had uncovered a hidden fortune sealed away for nearly a century. His children stood in the heart of it, their faces lit by the golden gleam and the flutter of fragile paper. But with the awe came the shadow of fear. Crane's interest made sense now. This wasn't about a broken-down boat. It was about the vault built into its bones. Ethan's hands closed tightly around the compass still in his pocket, the little map that had guided them here. The wake had offered up its final secret. But what it meant for them was far from clear. He turned to his children, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. What we do with this, it has to be careful. It can't be about greed. It has to mean something more. Daniel stared at the coins and bonds, struggling to imagine the weight of what lay before them. Lily only looked up at her father with quiet trust, her small hand slipping into his. Whitlock studied the vault with the solemn expression of someone who knew history had just shifted. The lantern flickered, casting the gleam of gold and the pale shine of paper across their faces. Outside, the tide pressed harder against the hull, as though the sea itself bore witness to the unveiling. The Aurora's wake had fulfilled its purpose, giving up what it had carried across decades of silence. What remained was the choice of its keepers, how to bear a fortune that was never meant to be found, and how to stand against the storm of men who would come to claim it. The air inside the hidden vault seemed heavier the longer they remained there, as if the ship itself were watching them weigh the gravity of what they had uncovered. The lantern light glowed against the steel walls, catching the edges of the crates, the sheen of coins, the crisp corners of bonds that had waited nearly a century to be touched again. Ethan carefully lifted another stack of wax-sealed sleeves from a container, setting them aside to make room for what lay beneath. His fingers brushed against a bundle of cloth, stiff with age, bound by twine that had nearly fused the fabric. He pulled it free, untying the brittle knot, and slowly unwrapped the contents. Inside lay a single leather folio, its cover scarred but intact, the surface impressed with a familiar sigil of the Brotherhood. Ethan's hands hesitated, his breath unsteady. Before he eased it open, The pages inside were not ledgers or financial records, but a carefully penned document written in a hand so deliberate it seemed designed to outlast time. The ink had faded to a deep brown, but the words were clear. Across the top, in large script, read the oath of stewardship. Ethan read the title aloud, and the silence in the chamber grew sharper. Whitlock stepped closer, her face pale but intent. "I've heard whispers of this," she murmured. "A charter, a binding document. The Brotherhood didn't only hide wealth. They had rules, laws for how it was to be guarded." Ethan turned the page, his eyes scanning the lines. The words spoke of duty, of secrecy, of holding assets not for personal enrichment, but for preservation of society should collapse return. The handwriting flowed with the confidence of men who believed themselves guardians of civilization. But what stopped Ethan's breath was a final passage, written in bold strokes that seemed almost defiant. Asterisk, he who finds his vessel and uncovers what it bears shall be bound as trustee, holding in faith and responsibility that which is preserved. The wealth shall not belong to him, but to the cause of endurance, and his oath shall be the stewardship above all desire. Asterisk. Ethan's hand trembled as he lowered the page. The weight of it pressed against him harder than the gold or the bonds ever could. Daniel stepped closer, frowning. "What does that even mean? Trustee? Are they saying you own it or not?" Whitlock's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Not ownership, stewardship." The Brotherhood believed their wealth had to remain in trusted hands, passed not through bloodlines or titles, but through discovery. Whoever uncovered the Wake's vault would inherit not the treasure, but the responsibility. Lily's small hand touched the edge of the folio, her eyes wide. "So it chose us." Daniel shook his head, frustration clouding his face. "That's insane. They can't just write something 100 years ago and expect us to follow it now. We need money for rent, for food. We could finally live without scraping by. And you're telling me we're supposed to just guard it? For some cause that doesn't even exist anymore." Ethan looked at his son, then at his daughter, then at the historian who watched with unblinking focus. The truth clawed at him. The document did not free them. It bound them tighter. Every instinct in him wanted to reject it, to claim the wealth as theirs after years of struggle. But the words burned in his mind, bound as trustee. He closed the folio slowly, holding as one might hold a verdict. "We didn't just find money," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "We found a responsibility. This isn't just about us anymore." Daniel turned away, jaw clenched, but said nothing. Lily pressed closer, her small frame trembling, but her faith unshaken. Whitlock exhaled softly, as if confirming what she feared all along. The Aurora's wake was never meant to enrich. It was meant to endure, and now it's chosen its keepers. The lantern flickered, shadows shifting across the steel vault as though the ship itself acknowledged the oath. The coins and papers glimmered around them, not as treasure, but as chains linking them to a duty carved into history. For the first time, Ethan felt the true cost of his gamble. Not just risk of debt or ridicule, but the weight of stewardship, a calling that stretched far beyond his own weary shoulders. The night was calm, the tide low, and the marina unusually quiet when the sound of footsteps broke the stillness. Ethan had been dozing in the cabin, the oath of stewardship still resting on the table beside him, when the creak of boards outside jolted him upright. Daniel stirred from his bunk, rubbing his eyes, and Lily sat up quickly, clutching her blanket. Ethan pressed a finger to his lips and moved to the window, peering through the cracked glass. Figures emerged from the mist. 4 of them, led by the sharp silhouette of Victor Crane. His polished shoes struck the dock without hurry, as if he already owned the ground he walked upon. Behind him, 3 men followed, broad-shouldered and purposeful, carrying no lanterns, their shadows stretched by the pale light of the moon. The scrape of metal echoed faintly as one adjusted the crowbar in his hand. Ethan's chest tightened. Crane had not come to talk. He had come to take. Daniel whispered from behind him, his voice tense. "They're here for the vault." Ethan nodded, pulling him close. "Get your sister. Stay quiet." But Crane's voice soon carried across the dock, smooth and deliberate, each word placed like a blade. "Mr. Ross, I gave you a chance to do this the easy way. I did warn you." He reached the gangplank, tapping it once with his cane. Now, step aside, and I'll see that no one gets hurt. You're trespassing on history you can't possibly protect." Ethan stepped out onto the deck before Daniel could stop him, his figure framed against a lantern light from the cabin. "This vessel belongs to my family. Whatever's inside, it stays with us." Crane's smile flickered, sharp and cold. He motioned to his men. "Then we'll remove you along with it." The first of the men stepped onto the gangplank, the wood groaning under his weight. Daniel appeared at Ethan's side. Fists clenched though fear clouded his face. Lily peered from the doorway, her eyes wide but unblinking. Whitlock had risen from the table behind her, the folio tucked beneath her arm, her expression tight with urgency. Ethan moved forward, gripping a length of pipe he had kept from the repairs. "You're not boarding this ship." The man on the gangplank sneered, taking another step, but Ethan swung hard at the rail. The blow echoed like a warning shot, and the man hesitated, the gangplank trembling under his boots. "You'd fight us with rusted metal?" Crane's voice was mocking, but Ethan heard the faintest edge of irritation behind it. Whitlock spoke then, her voice sharp, cutting through the night. "Careful, Crane. You might seize the ship, but the ledgers are already copied. Copies that could make their way to very public hands." Crane turned his gaze on her, his composure cracking for a heartbeat. "You're bluffing." Her expression didn't waver. "Am I?" The pause stretched, the men shifting uneasily, the weight of doubt pressing against Crane's command. Ethan used the moment, stepping squarely before the gangplank. "You'll never get what you're after this way. The Aurora's wake isn't just a boat. It's bound to an oath. And even if you strip her bare, you'll never hold what she carries." Crane's jaw tightened, his grip on the cane widening. For a moment, the night hung on the edge of violence. Then he lifted his hand, signaling his men to step back. "Enjoy your illusions, Ross," he said, his tone low with promise. "But illusions collapse. And when they do, I'll be here to claim what's left." He turned sharply, his men falling into step behind him. Their retreating footsteps faded into the mist, leaving only the sound of water lapping against the hull and the pounding of Ethan's heart in his ears. Daniel exhaled shakily, his voice breaking the silence. "He's not done. He'll come back." Ethan lowered the pipe, his hand still trembling. "I know." He looked back at his children, then at Whitlock holding the Brotherhood's oath close against her chest. "And next time, he won't just come with words." The morning after Crane's attempt at boarding, the marina was thick with unease. Word spread quickly among the dock workers. Men in suits had come at night, demanding entry onto Ethan's battered vessel, only to leave empty-handed. By sunrise, whispers floated along the pier like gulls, some mocking Ethan for clinging to a rotting coffin, others lowering their voices in wary respect. Ethan ignored them all. He sat at the small table in the cabin with Whitlock and a man who looked as out of place among ropes and nets as Crane himself. James Carter, a lawyer Ethan had known since childhood. James was broad-shouldered, with thinning hair and a habit of drumming his fingers on whatever surface lay in front of him. He had come straight from his office in town, his suit rumpled from haste, his briefcase stuffed with files. Ethan had called him after the confrontation, knowing Crane's threats would not stop at intimidation. Now, James leaned over the table, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the documents Crane had tried to use the night before. "These are flimsy," James muttered, shaking his head. "Abandoned vessel clauses don't hold if there's clear evidence of ownership transfer. You bought this boat at a public auction, Ethan. There's a record, a bill of sale, signatures. Crane can't simply overwrite that with salvage claims." Whitlock leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "But he will try. The Brotherhood's money doesn't disappear without protection. Crane represents interests who've waited decades to bury this ship. He'll drag Ethan through the courts until he's ruined, unless we cut through his lies before they take root." Ethan's hands tightened around the compass resting on the table. "Then what do we do?" James snapped his briefcase shut, pulling himself upright. "We take the fight to him. You don't sit back and hope he tires himself out. You make his threats look ridiculous in the open." The timing proved sharp. That very afternoon, Crane returned, not with hired men but with papers. He stood at the dock in broad daylight, polished as ever, the fog lifting around him as though even the weather parted for his stride. In his hand was a folder stamped with legal seals, and his voice carried clearly across the water. "Mr. Ross," he called, his tone crisp, designed to draw the attention of the nearby fishermen. "I've filed claims of improper auction and abandonment. By law, this vessel and her contents are under dispute. I urge you to vacate before further complications arise." Ethan stepped onto the deck with James and Whitlock at his side. Daniel and Lily stood close behind, their eyes fixed on Crane. James spoke first, his voice firm, the courtroom cadence carrying across the dock. "Mr. Crane, your claims are baseless. The Aurora's wake was sold legally under the authority of the auction house. My client possesses the full bill of sale. Your salvage rights hold no merit when the vessel was neither derelict nor abandoned but auctioned with title." Crane's smile faltered only slightly. "Legalities are flexible, Mr. Carter. The wake was never properly discharged. That makes her open for contest." Whitlock stepped forward then, her presence commanding, flexible only to those who believe the public can be fooled. The Aurora's wake isn't an abandoned fishing boat. She's a documented vessel tied to the Preservation Brotherhood. If you wish to bring this to court, I'll be more than happy to testify on record about her historical significance and the archives your clients clearly fear. A murmur rose from the onlookers, dock hands drawn by the clash. Crane's eyes flicked toward them, irritation sparking beneath his composure. He straightened, smoothing his coat. "You overestimate what stories and symbols mean to the law." James smiled thinly. "You underestimate what the law means to stories and symbols. Ethan owns this ship, and any attempt to seize her without court approval will be trespass. You've already overstepped once. Do it again and you'll face charges." For a long moment, Crane stood perfectly still, his cane tapping once against the dock. His smile returned brittle and cold. "Very well. If you wish to play this in court, we'll play. But understand this, Ross. Law is slow, expensive, and merciless. You'll drown long before you see justice." Ethan's voice was steady when he answered, "Maybe, but at least I won't drown alone. This ship has more allies than you think." Crane's eyes flicked to Whitlock, then to the compass glinting faintly in Ethan's hand. A shadow crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared, and he turned without another word, his shoes clicking sharply against the dock until the sound faded into the bustle of the marina. Silence lingered in his wake, broken only by the slap of water against the hull. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "He's not finished," he said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed, gripping the compass tighter. "But neither are we." The marina had never seen so much attention. By mid-morning, the narrow dock where the Aurora's wake rested was crowded with more than curious fishermen and gossiping neighbors. 2 government cars were parked near the edge of the lot, their doors marked with state seals, while a Coast Guard cutter idled just beyond the harbor, its gray hull looming like a reminder that the water was never fully free of authority. Ethan stood on the deck, watching as uniformed men and suited officials moved with clipped purpose, their radios crackling, their notebooks ready. Professor Whitlock had made the call the night before, after Crane's latest threat. She had spoken in measured tones into the receiver, identifying herself and explaining that the Aurora's wake was not simply a derelict vessel in dispute, but a historically significant artifact tied to the secretive Preservation Brotherhood. The reaction had been swift. Now, officials were here to see for themselves. A woman in a dark suit introduced herself first. "Deputy Director Hayes, State Historical Office," she said, offering a firm handshake to Ethan. Her eyes swept the ship with a mixture of skepticism and interest. "Professor Whitlock tells me you've uncovered material of national importance." Behind her, a Coast Guard officer in crisp whites, Lieutenant Mason, climbed aboard with 2 crewmen. His expression was serious, his movements efficient. "We're here to assess the safety of the vessel," he said, glancing toward the rusted railings and peeling paint. "If she's unstable, we can't allow people crawling through her holds." Ethan nodded, though his jaw tightened. "She's held through worse than anyone expected," he said. "But it's not the paint you came for." He led them below deck, Whitlock beside him, her satchel slung across her shoulder, Daniel and Lily trailing close. The lanterns lit their way as they descended into the false chamber, the air damp and close. When Hayes saw the crate stacked neatly against the steel-lined walls, her eyes widened despite herself. Whitlock guided her to one of the open boxes, drawing back the lid to reveal the preserved bonds and certificates. The Coast Guard men exchanged looks, one letting out a low whistle before quickly regaining his composure. "These aren't trinkets," Whitlock explained, her voice measured but urgent. "They're original Depression-era assets, preserved intentionally, tied directly to the Preservation Brotherhood. Their ledgers connect financial networks that shaped entire markets. This isn't salvage, it's a historical vault." Hayes reached for one of the documents, gingerly examining the wax seal that had kept it intact for nearly a century. She looked up at Ethan. "You understand this changes the scope of everything. If authenticated, these materials belong in state archives, perhaps even federal custody." Daniel's face tightened, his voice breaking through. "So, you're just gonna take it? After everything we've been through to uncover it?" Lieutenant Mason's tone was practical, almost blunt. "Son, if a private citizen sits on something like this, it attracts attention you don't want. Organized crime, foreign interests. Your family would be crushed under the weight of it." Ethan placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, though his own chest tightened at the thought. "We didn't come looking for fortune," he said quietly. "The wake found us, but we won't hand it over just to see it disappear into another vault no one ever opens." Hayes studied him carefully, her professional mask slipping into something almost sympathetic. "No one's saying it will disappear, but it must be preserved properly under law. That means oversight, authentication, and likely federal involvement." Whitlock stepped in then, her voice carrying weight, and Mr. Ross remained central. The oath of stewardship names a finder as trustee. That document is part of the discovery. If the state takes custody, it cannot erase the role of this family. That will betray the very conditions under which this vault was sealed. The officials fell silent at that, the weight of Whitlock's words hanging in the air. Even the Coast Guard officers seemed uncertain, their disciplined composure cracking at the mention of a written oath binding past the present. Hayes closed the crate slowly, her gaze steady on Ethan. "We'll need time to determine the proper course. But know this, whatever you've uncovered is no longer just yours. It belongs to history now." Outside, the cutter's engines hummed, a low reminder that the government's eyes were fixed on the Aurora's wake. Daniel clenched his fists, Lily clutched her sketchbook tighter, and Ethan felt the ship groan softly beneath his feet, as if the vessel itself knew it had once again become the center of forces larger than any family could control. "Would you like me to carry directly into the next chapter, where Crane exploits the government's arrival to press his claims further, or pause to let Ethan and Whitlock discuss the implications of the state stepping in before the next confrontation?" The days that followed were long and heavy with waiting. Officials moved in and out of the Aurora's wake, cataloging, photographing, and carefully lifting the preserved assets from their steel vaults. Documents were scanned, gold coins weighed and sealed in protective cases, ledgers reviewed under the watchful eyes of historians and lawyers. The presence of state archivists and Coast Guard officers became almost routine, their uniforms a constant reminder that the Ross family no longer stood alone in their discovery. But through it all, Ethan held his ground, his children at his side, Professor Whitlock never far away, and James Carter battling tirelessly on their behalf. When the final hearings were called, they were held not in a courthouse, but in a converted hall overlooking the harbor, the scent of brine and salt air drifting into the tall windows. Officials from the state sat at a long table, papers stacked before them, their expressions grave but not unfriendly. Victor Crane had tried, as expected, to wedge himself into proceedings. His lawyers filed claim after claim, each one circling back to salvage rights, abandonment, and the supposed illegitimacy of the auction. Yet time and again, James cut through them with precision, brandishing bills of sale, historical precedents, and most importantly, the oath of stewardship. The folio, bound in its worn leather, lay at the center of the table as if it were another witness. Its words carried more weight than Crane's legal threats could ever muster. It spoke not only of wealth but of responsibility, binding whoever uncovered the vault to act not as an owner, but as a trustee. And with Professor Whitlock verifying its authenticity, the officials found themselves with little choice. History had spoken in its own hand, and the Ross family had answered its call. On the morning the decision was delivered, the hall was crowded. Fishermen who had once mocked Ethan for throwing his savings at a wreck now leaned forward in silence. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens scratching quickly across notebooks. Crane sat stiffly in the corner, his jaw tight, his presence a shadow rather than a force. Deputy Director Hayes stood to speak, her voice clear and steady. After review of the evidence, including the oath of stewardship, it is a judgment of this body that the Ross family shall be recognized as the lawful stewards of the vessel Aurora's wake and its preserved contents. The assets contained therein shall be cataloged and safeguarded in partnership with the State Historical Office, but trusteeship, as outlined by the original document, shall remain with Mr. Ethan Ross and his heirs. The word seemed to hang in the air before settling over Ethan like a tide finally turning. He looked down at Lily, who clutched his hand tightly, her face bright with wonder, and at Daniel, whose doubtful eyes now shone with something closer to pride. For the first time in years, they weren't simply scraping by. They weren't surviving on borrowed time and thinning patience. They had been chosen, recognized, not for wealth alone, but for the responsibility to guard a piece of history. Crane rose without a word, his face pale with restrained fury. His lawyers gathered their papers quickly, but no amount of silence could disguise the truth. He had lost. The tide had shifted, and the Aurora's wake was no longer a prize to be stolen. It was a legacy acknowledged, one the Ross family carried by right. That evening, as the sun fell low and painted the marina gold, Ethan stood on the deck of the wake with his children beside him. The boat still bore her scars, rust, peeling paint, timbers weathered by storms. But now she felt alive, her purpose restored. Fishermen passing on the dock tipped their caps in respect. Neighbors who once sneered stopped to offer quiet congratulations. Daniel leaned against the railing, his voice quieter than usual. So this is it. We're keepers of something bigger than us. Ethan put a hand on his son's shoulder, steady and sure. Yes, and we'll carry it together. Lily pressed her sketchbook against her chest, smiling. She was waiting for us all along. The lanterns glowed softly in the growing dusk, the ship rocking gently with tide. A new dawn had come for the Ross family, not in sudden riches or easy comfort, but in recognition, purpose, and the steady strength of a vessel that had chosen them as her guardians. The Aurora's wake was no longer a gamble. She was their inheritance and their charge. The marina was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that comes after long weeks of noise and struggle. The officials had gone, the reporters too, leaving behind only the sound of water brushing against the hull and the faint creak of ropes shifting in the tide. Lanterns glowed softly on the deck of the Aurora's wake, their light casting warm circles that flickered against the old wood. Ethan stood near the bow, his hands resting on the rail, looking out over the dark horizon. Behind him, Daniel and Lily sat cross-legged on the deck, their sketchbook and tools forgotten for once, their faces turned toward their father, as if waiting for something they could not quite name. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. He listened to the boat beneath him, to the sigh of timbers and the whisper of the sea. It felt alive, as though the wake herself had been holding her breath through the long silence of decades and was only now exhaling. Finally, he turned back to his children, his expression softer than they had seen in weeks. You know, he began quietly, when I first raised my hand at that auction, I didn't know why. Everyone thought I was being foolish. Maybe I thought so too. It wasn't logic. It wasn't numbers on a page. It was a feeling, like the boat was calling to us. Daniel tilted his head, a flicker of the old doubt still in his eyes. And now, after everything, do you still think it was just a feeling? Ethan smiled faintly. No, now I know it was something more. This ship carried secrets across oceans, kept them safe through storms, and waited all these years for someone to uncover them. But the treasure she gave us isn't just coins or papers. It's proof that we can face storms of our own and still hold together. Lily leaned forward, her hands clasped around her knees. You mean the storm at sea? Or Crane? All of it, Ethan said. He crouched down to meet them eye to eye, his voice steady, rich with the weight of what he'd come to understand. Every trial we faced, mockery at the dock, Margaret's doubts, the storm that nearly took us, Even Crane's threats, they were tests. This boat didn't just hide treasure. She reminded us that storms will always come. But if we stand together, if we trust each other, we'll weather them. Daniel looked down, his hands fidgeting. But when he raised his gaze again, there was something new there, acceptance, even pride. So, it's not just about keeping the gold safe. No, Ethan said firmly, it's about what we do with it. The Brotherhood thought they were preserving civilization, but they were just preserving power. Our job is different. We carry this forward as a family, not to hoard, not to hide, but to live with the knowledge that legacy isn't measured in what you own. It's measured in what you endure together. Lily's eyes glistened in the lantern light. She moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder. Then we'll keep her safe too. The wake. She's part of us now. Ethan wrapped an arm around her and looked at Daniel, who had stepped forward to rest his hands on the rail beside them. For the first time in years, the boy stood with a steadiness that mirrored his father's own. The silence stretched, warm and full, broken only by the rhythm of the sea. Ethan finally spoke, his voice little more than a vow carried into the night. I promise you both, whatever comes, we'll face it together. This ship isn't just a vessel. She's our proof that no matter how hard the world tries to break us, we can hold, we can endure, and we can carry something forward that no storm can wash away. The lanterns flickered as if in agreement, and the Aurora's wake rocked gently beneath them, her timbers groaning like an old guardian settling into rest. Daniel closed his eyes, Lily clung tighter, and Ethan stood between them, feeling, for the first time, that the storms had not broken them, but shaped them into something stronger. The sea stretched out endless and dark, but for the Ross family, it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like promise.